February 20th, 1926. Clara Newman stands at the bottom of a dusty staircase to greet a prospective tenant for her San Francisco boarding house. Standing in front of the 60-year-old landlady is a man wearing a shabby suit and an ugly tie. He's not tall, just 5'7" or 5'8", but he is incredibly well built. Under his Stetson hat, she glimpses piercing blue eyes. His mouth and nose seem too large for his face. Clara's gaze moves over his muscular arms, down to his oversized, callous hands with thick fingers and scarred knuckles. She's never seen hands so gnarled. "Are you the lady with a room for rent?" he asks. His eyes drift toward the string of pearls hanging around Clara's shoulders and delicate neck. But then, as though he's been caught, he brings the leather-backed Bible he's carrying to his chest, a gesture meant to reassure. And it works. Clara warms to him even if she can't imagine this man reading scripture. Against her better judgment, she invites him inside. She takes him to the room on a higher floor. It's the biggest mistake she'll ever make, and the last. Her body was later found in one of the unoccupied attic apartments. The cord used to strangle her pulled so tight it had cut through her flesh. When her body went limp, he kept beating on her. This was a depraved man, capable of crimes unlike anything police had ever encountered. Clara had opened her door to the man who would become America's most prolific killer, a man whose body count won't be surpassed for almost 50 years. Demented and utterly ruthless, he will defy the usual descriptions given to people who murder. He doesn't kill out of desperation, greed, or fear, but from a primal compulsion, a dark necessity barely understood in the early 20th century, let alone today. He is a serial killer long before the term was ever used. But in that moment to Clara, he was just Roger Wilson, a man of faith, but the world would come to know him by a different name, the Gorilla Killer. Traveling across the USA and later Canada, he would leave a trail of bodies behind him. Those who caught sight of him, who talked to him and survived, all remarked on his ape-like appearance, his huge, strong hands, his thick chest and shoulders, and yet he was remarkably polite. He would always carry a scuffed Bible with him, pages he'd read voraciously since childhood. He'd often quote scripture to his victims moments before he killed them. They never stood a chance. One thing was clear, this wasn't your average killer, and Clara Newman was only the beginning. But where does a man who looks like a dock worker, speaks like a preacher, and kills like an animal come from? Men like Roger Wilson don't just appear out of thin air. They're made. Really quickly though, this is our new channel for all things true crime. We'll be doing deep dives into serial killers, strange disappearances, and all kinds of crazy, insane crime stories. You won't want to miss them, so be sure to like the video, subscribe, and tell us what you want to see next in the comments. The Gorilla Man was born Earle Nelson in San Francisco on May 12, 1897. His mother Frances died from syphilis when he was around 10 months old, and his father died from the same terrifying disease roughly half a year later. An orphan, Earle went to live with his grandparents, Jenny and Lars, and after his grandmother died, he spent the rest of his childhood with his Aunt Lillian. But Jenny's death left a scar in Earle's mind that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A strict Puritan Pentecostal, his formative years were filled with her stories of the devil, a fire and brimstone reality, where almost everyone and everything was wicked. But it was more than that. Something inside of him was broken, like his mind had been compromised. He seemed to hate himself as soon as he could talk. He wasn't like the other kids in the neighborhood. His teachers at primary school noticed he had a fascination with death. He scared people even at a young age. At 7, he was expelled for bad behavior. Then 3 years later, something happened that would change him forever. He was riding a bicycle down the street when he was hit by a streetcar. His head was wedged under the fender, bashing against the cobblestones for 50 feet. He lay in a coma, and beneath the bandages, a huge hole gaped in his skull. Doctors told his Aunt Lillian that he likely wouldn't wake up, and even if he did survive, he would be severely brain damaged. But the doctors were wrong about him never walking again. After 6 days of being in a coma, young Earle Nelson came back to life, and besides some memory loss, he seemed like his old self. But it was soon clear that some kind of metamorphosis had taken place. It began with agonizing migraines that would leave him curled up in the fetal position. When he would spring back to life, he seemed demonic. It was as if the devil had snuck in through the hole in his head while he lay in his coma. Other kids in the neighborhood kept their distance as his behavior became more and more erratic. He talked to people who weren't there, hallucinating, walking with them down the street as he quoted passages from the Bible. He had forgotten so much of his life, but his late grandma Jenny's scriptures seemed hard-coded. Puberty is never easy, but for Earle it was catastrophic. He would spy on his cousin when she was undressing. Sometimes he'd walk out of the house and return days later, dirty, stinking, his clothes ripped as if he'd attacked someone. He would never explain where he'd been. He would just sit there silent, then sometimes out of nowhere, fly into a rage. Visitors stopped coming to Lillian's house. Earle would just stare at them, glaring like he was possessed. When Lillian would look into his room, he'd be talking to ghosts, clutching his Bible to his chest, citing the Book of Revelation. At least he's devout, she'd tell herself. For all his faults, he was still a child of God. But there was something else that stood out about Earle Nelson: his strength. He had been walking on his hands for years. It seemed to ease the migraines. His arms, shoulders, wrists, and chest became so strong that he could have joined the circus. He could lift heavy objects with his mouth. Wild, animal-like. Impressive, but terrifying. To the few doctors who examined him, he was simply mad. One of them noted in Earle's file that he was a psychotic prodigy. It was frightening to witness. And then he grew into a young man. He wasn't wired like the other teenage boys. His sexual urges were much more intense, perhaps from his damaged frontal cortex, denying him his natural inhibitions. He started hanging out around the brothels in San Francisco's red light district and soon contracted a venereal disease. He couldn't stop, but if he wanted to keep patronizing the brothels, he needed money. His first arrest came in 1915 at age 18 for robbery. He spent 2 years in San Quentin during an era where the guards took pleasure in beating up prisoners, especially the young ones. Earle was paroled on September 6, 1916, only to be arrested again just a half year later in Stockton on March 9, 1917, for petty larceny, which led to 6 more months behind bars. By then, he was already experimenting with names, telling the police that he was Earle Clark. After his next arrest, this time for burglary, he called himself Mr. Farrell. Another 6 months, this time in LA County Jail. But he had had enough. He broke out, and this time he ran, something that would define his life. In 1918, after joining the U.S. Navy, he was committed to the Napa State Mental Hospital after acting so strangely he scared the other men. A doctor said Earle was living in a constitutional psychotic state. He was deranged, called violent, homicidal, destructive. A psychologist who treated him noted his terrible migraines, that Earle would see faces that weren't there, hear music that wasn't playing, that he was always thinking people were trying to poison him. He heard voices that told him to hurt himself, the same self-hating voices he'd heard since he was a kid. He escaped 3 times from that hospital. It got to the point that the staff nicknamed him Houdini, but Earle's greatest escapes were still many years away. In the meantime, though, maybe what he needed was a steady relationship. In 1919, Earle was now calling himself Mr. Evan Lewis Fuller and working as a janitor in the hospital where he met Mary. Mary was 58 years old, 36 years his senior, but the age gap didn't seem to bother her. She was shy and lacked confidence, and the two married that same year. She worked at a Catholic school while he did nothing after leaving his job as a janitor. He promised that he'd get a new job, but he never did. Instead, he'd often leave the house and not return until days later, always in someone else's clothes. It drove her crazy, literally. His jealous, his constant, indignant preaching of the Bible, the threats to her life, it all added up, and finally it gave her a nervous breakdown. As she lay in the hospital bed, Earle accused the doctor of sleeping with her. He jumped on her like he couldn't control himself. It took a group of orderlies to pull him off. His grip felt like being fastened in a vice. Again he ran. He ran from his marriage. He ran from the closest thing he'd ever had to an ordinary life, until on May 19, 1921, he stopped. "I'm here for the plumbing," he merrily told the maid at a house owned by Mr. Charles Summer on Pacific Avenue in San Francisco. Earle snuck down into the basement where Charles's daughter Mary was playing. It was her older brother who'd heard the screams. He rushed to the basement. A powerful-looking man had his hands clasped tightly around his sister's neck. Earle might have killed her, but caught in the act, he instead ran, fleeing the house. He was captured hours later while riding a trolley by 2 police officers, and it took both of them to hold him down. On June 13th, psychiatric doctors back at Napa Hospital noted Earle wasn't merely a criminal, he was probably untreatable. He was also too strong and wily to be detained by orderlies and nurses. He broke out again, twice, getting caught both times. He was simply impossible to help. So in 1925, the hospital kicked him out onto the street. Where he went or what he did during this time isn't certain. Sometimes he visited Aunt Lillian, but he was soon off wandering again, and it appears that he may have made his way to the East Coast. October 18th might have been the date of his first murder. It's not officially recorded, but it sure bore the marks of his style. The victim was Ola McCoy, murdered at her house in Philadelphia. Hanging in her window was a sign, "Room for rent." Strangled, violated. It fit Earle's future MO perfectly. A similar sign was hanging in the room of Mae Murray when on November 6th, also in Philadelphia, she received a visit. She was later found dead, her neck tied with what police called a complicated sailor's knot. The same thing happened to Lillian Weiner a few days later. Her room for rent sign was still hanging when her dead body was discovered by the police. Once again, it seemed to match Earle. The killer had used the same kind of knot, and he had violated the body in death. 3 murders, and while they've never been officially tied to him, when it comes to murder, very few bodies are found showing signs of post-mortem violation. But each of these victims bore Earle's depraved trademark. He also had stolen from every one of the victims. The murders weren't just sexually driven, they were opportunistic. He pawned their possessions, and when the money ran out, he killed again. After Philadelphia, he did what always came most natural to him. He ran west, this time across the country, back toward the city where he'd been born. And it was only when he returned home that the system finally truly noticed him. For the first time, a city would understand it wasn't dealing with a burglar, a drifter, or even a murderer, but a monster. Clara Newman had been running boarding houses in San Francisco for years, so she thought she knew the type of man standing in front of her. Traveling salesmen, dock workers, widowers looking for a cheap room. She prided herself on reading people quickly. She lived alone in the building, renting rooms to make ends meet. And the pearls she wore weren't just decoration. They were one of the few pieces of jewelry she owned, something she wore when meeting prospective tenants to project stability and respectability. And when Earle saw those pearls around her neck in February of 1926, he could barely take his eyes off of them. His plan was almost foiled when Clara led him upstairs to the room and they bumped into her nephew, Merton Newman. Merton got a really good look at him and saw him eyeing his aunt's precious pearls. Later, he would recall the man's strange laugh, kind of menacing, he said, and that he was cracking his giant knuckles like he was preparing for a fight. Merton didn't think much of it at the time. The man was odd, yes, but odd men rented rooms every day in San Francisco. A short while later, Clara was alone with him on the upper floor. No one heard the struggle. When it was over, he dragged her to one of the empty attic rooms and left her there. The person who murdered Clara had strangled her with such force that her neck was crushed. After the cord, he used his hands, his long fingernails digging into her flesh, likely when she was already unconscious. Detective Lieutenant Charles Dulia and Inspector Francis Frank Latulippe of the San Francisco Police knew they were looking for a sadist, what was sometimes called a lust killer. These murders were deranged, and in the future, profilers would call this a signature, a unique calling card of a serial killer. When the press learned the details, they nicknamed whoever did it the Dark Strangler. They had no idea that this would be just a first in a long line of confirmed victims. Lieutenant Dulia and his men searched high and low for what sounded like a man who should stand out in a crowd. But it was as if he had disappeared, swallowed by the mist that rolls in from the Pacific Ocean. They didn't know it yet, but their killer was an escape artist, an expert in deception and misdirection. On March 2, 1926, less than 2 weeks after Clara was murdered, Earle's second victim, 63-year-old Laura Beale, was found dead in her home in San Jose, about 48 miles from Clara's San Francisco rooming house. Like Clara, she'd been violently strangled and violated in death. Dulia was convinced it had to be the work of the same deranged man. Witnesses talked about seeing a short, stocky man. In his large hands, he clasped what looked like a dog-eared Bible. Dulia sent his men to check every pawn shop in the vicinity of San Francisco. Those pearls that killer had taken from Clara were valuable. And judging by what the witnesses said about his shabby clothes, it was likely he didn't have much money. No doubt he'd try to sell the jewels. The police weren't able to locate a suspect, though, and on June 10th, there was another body. This time, it was at a rooming house on San Francisco's Dolores Street. The landlady, Lillian St. Mary, had been strangled, and her naked body had been hidden under her bed. The city's residents were on edge. They were being hunted by someone whose description sounded like a half-man, half-beast. 6 days after Lillian, he tried again. He knocked on the door of a fifth-floor apartment on Clay Street, where Mrs. P.A. Ford answered the door. He made sure she saw the Bible and went as far as to quote some scripture to her. He was very well built, with what she called the hands of a giant. But something about him didn't feel right. Maybe it was his strange, shifty blue eyes. He asked to see a room on the 3rd floor, and had she taken him there, she'd almost certainly have become victim number 4. But she told him to wait. She had to get her husband. He looked at her with rage burning in his eyes. "No problem, I don't want it now." She closed the door and Earle left, but he didn't go far. The Fords lived on the 5th floor of the apartment building, and the man who had just visited them went down just 1 floor and knocked on the door of a Mrs. Stidger. When she answered the door, he told her that he was here to fix her telephone. She looked him up and down, and that was enough. Not today. She closed the door. He turned away, exasperated, and he went to find the manager, Gladys Dunn. Unlike the other women, she wasn't put off by his appearance. Yes, there was a room for rent. He was smiling, cracking the joints of his giant hands as he stealthily walked behind her down the landing. And then, something unexpected happened. The apartment janitor turned a corner and met them in the middle. The killer did an about turn and walked away. 3 women, 3 close calls. The next day, on June 16th, more women reported meeting a man who asked to rent an apartment but suddenly changed his mind once another man appeared. By this point, he was all over the newspapers. So many witnesses had seen him, all of them shocked at his strange facial features and oversized hands. In the press, the Dark Strangler became the Gorilla Killer, or sometimes just the Gorilla Man. He was stalking the streets and looking for more women to kill. That much was obvious. And it wasn't just San Francisco. The whole of California feared getting a knock on the door from the brute with a Bible. Stocky men were arrested and released. Angry mobs took the law into their own hands. In Santa Cruz, they seized an innocent man and nearly lynched him if Lieutenant D'Elia hadn't arrived to stop them. The real killer was about to strike again, though, this time further down the coast. In Santa Barbara, about 325 miles south of San Francisco, Ollie Russell was found dead on June 24th. She had been strangled so violently with a curtain cord that it cut through her jugular vein, spraying blood across the apartment. On August 16th, Mary Nisbet had answered the door of her apartment in Oakland, just across the bay from San Francisco. She was later found in the bathroom, blood pooling around her violated body. There were now 5 confirmed victims in California alone. After that, though, things went quiet. No more house calls, no more bodies. D'Elia wondered if this case mirrored that of Jack the Ripper in London nearly 40 years earlier. The sheer derangement in that case was the only crime that he could compare this one to. After killing 5 women, the Ripper had stopped for no apparent reason. Maybe the Gorilla Man had too. It would be many years until the police developed profiling, but one of the other detectives didn't think that that would be the case here. He told D'Elia that a sexual maniac wouldn't just quit. He would more likely escalate, only stopping if he was caught. For him, killing was a compulsion, a necessity. He was absolutely right, and the maniac of San Francisco was about to spread his wings. After the 5 known victims in California, the Gorilla Man was a feature in newspapers, and Earle knew that he had to get out of state. He chose Portland, a long 635-mile drive from his home base of San Francisco. This was before the age of police databases and connected departments, so a new city wasn't just a new hunting ground, it was a fresh start. And it was here that Earle's nationwide tour of terror was about to begin. October 19, 1926, almost 2 months after the Mary Nesbitt murder, Earle knocked on the door of Beata Withers. When she turned her back to him, he clasped his hands around her neck, squeezing the life out of her. He left her body stuffed inside of a trunk next to a bundle of old love letters. A few days later, Virginia Grant was unfortunate enough to lose the lottery of Earle's house visits. He murdered her and hid her body in the basement. Earle then knocked on the door of Mabel Fluke. She was killed and he hid her body in the attic. 3 kills in just 6 days. His body count was now up to 8 confirmed murders. Portland police were only just figuring out that this was the work of the same maniac when Earle took off again to continue his murderous road trip across North America. But he couldn't just stay away from the city that had once scrambled his mind. With Lieutenant D'Elia and Detective La Tulipe still reeling from the last series of murders in San Francisco, Earle struck again on November 18th. This time, the victim was Anna Edmonds, aged 56, and she was treated just like the others. strangled, and then violated. Dalia found her body stuffed under her bed. Her son described seeing her talking to a man about selling her house, a stocky man with large hands. Dalia thought the killer was now pushing his luck. He was right under their noses. Then Earle made a mistake. He left a survivor. He attacked Mrs. H.C. Murray in Burlingame, a city just south of San Francisco. Posing as a potential boarder and being ever so polite, she invited him inside while proudly telling him about her pregnancy. When she turned her back, he throttled her. But Murray was fighting for two. She hit and scratched and kicked, screaming at the top of her lungs. Earle thought he heard the neighbors coming and decided to flee. He knew he'd been seen close up, though, and that he had to get out of California. Within 5 days, he made Seattle, Washington his new home. Earle didn't mind the long haul. He hopped trains, he hitched, he walked. Functionally, he was a drifter doing what he always loved the most, wandering. His only possession was his Bible. He would preach from it whenever anyone would listen. And that's what he did before he murdered Florence Monks at her Seattle home. Murder victim number 10. He was now in the double digits, and all in less than a year. But he didn't stick around the city to add to that number. Instead, he made his way back to Portland. There, he knocked on the door of his next victim, Blanche Myers. The Portland newspapers churned out story after story about a crazed maniac stalking the city. The police station took hundreds of calls. Women were afraid to answer the door. Lieutenant Dalia was going out of his mind. He was now aware that his killer was covering a lot of ground. He didn't have much hard evidence yet, but he was sure about one thing. The killer almost always stole or bought new clothes before he knocked on a new door. His hair was just cut and his face shaved. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. And then came the break. A woman had called the Portland police telling them that a man going by the name of Adrian Harris had been staying at her boarding house around the time of the Blanche Myers murder. On the exact day she was killed, the man had told some of the other boarders that he was taking off. This was strange because he'd paid in advance for a few more days. Even stranger, though, was that this man, who didn't appear to have much money, had given a few of the female boarders some women's jewelry. Police soon discovered the jewelry had belonged to Florence Monks. After hearing the descriptions of his face and body, the police knew almost for certain it was the gorilla killer. But there was about to be another breakthrough in the case. Fingerprints had been left at many of the crime scenes, and after being compared against state records, they finally had a hit. They matched a man with a long history of arrests and escapes from Napa State Hospital, a man with multiple aliases and identities. But Dalia could now give the gorilla killer a real name: Earle Leonard Nelson. Earle had told the women at the boarding house that he was leaving for good, packing up his things and never coming back. His destination, Vancouver, Washington, about 15 miles away. Of course, Earle had been lying, but now he was a marked man. In San Francisco, everyone knew not to open their door to a strange man. Large hands, Bible, slammed the door shut. It was the same in Portland. Police had warned in a bulletin that absolutely no one should show their rental rooms to a stranger if they were not accompanied by a man, or better still, the police. They ended their bulletin with, "We do not wish unduly to alarm the people of Portland, but there is no denying the situation is grave." And it certainly was, but not for the women of Portland. Earle had already moved on. He hitched rides and hopped trains all the way to Council Bluffs, Iowa, a long journey of almost 1,700 miles. And in this small, sleepy Iowa town, the name of the gorilla killer was far from anyone's mind. And that's why when Earle knocked on the door of Elmira Berard's home on December 23rd, she let him inside. When she turned her back, he wrapped a piece of cloth around her neck and squeezed until she dropped. Elmira had not long before been confined to a mental institution, so police at first thought she had committed herself to an early grave. It was only after the coroner saw what had happened to her body after death that they knew they were looking for a murderer, a very depraved one at that. But their killer had already moved on. If the railroad went there, so did Earle. He was like a virus spreading across the country, infecting everywhere he stopped with pain and fear. He next popped up in Kansas City, Missouri, about 182 miles away. Just 4 days after arriving, he strangled 23-year-old Bonnie Pace. She just celebrated Christmas Day with her husband when Earle came knocking. The husband was out, and he returned home later to find her dead and violated upstairs in a bedroom. Germania Harpin and her 8-month-old son Robert were the next victims. Same MO, same deranged signature. The husband came home to a sight that tormented him until the day he died. Earle was now at 15 confirmed victims. His stay in Kansas City was short though, and he soon hopped a train back to his old hunting grounds in Philadelphia. There, on April 27, 1927, he murdered Mary McConnell. A day later, an owner of a pawn shop told a man with very large hands that she wasn't interested in buying a watch. The watch, of course, belonged to Mary McConnell. Earle might have been mad, but he wasn't stupid. He had to keep moving. He rode the train to Buffalo, New York. There, on May 30th, he murdered Jenny Randolph, age 53, after asking about a room and introducing himself as Charles Harrison. She was found 3 days later under a bed. After Buffalo, the guerrilla killer kept moving west on his cross-country road trip of murder. His next stop, Detroit. When Earle arrived there and knocked on the door of a boarding house managed by 53-year-old Fannie Mae, she allowed him and his Bible inside. Her body, along with one of her other renters, 29-year-old Maureen Oswalda Torthy, were later found by the owner of the building. Fannie Mae had been garroted, and the electrical cord from a table lamp was still around her neck. A clue, at last. The killer had cut the lamp while it was still turned on. That meant the knife he used would likely have been burned. If they could locate a man who fit the guerrilla killer's description with a singed blade, then they might have the proof they needed. Earle was already gone, though. He had hopped a train and traveled 280 miles to Chicago, and that's where he murdered Mary Sietsima. On June 2nd, her husband, whose clothes had been stolen, found her lying on the floor, the cord from an electrical appliance around her neck. Earle was out of control. His road trip of death had now left him with a staggering 20 victims to his name. But Earle was somehow about to escalate to an even higher plane of depravity. Lieutenant Dullea had heard about the other murders across the country and knew they must be the work of Earle. He now had a name, a description, fingerprints, and a bevy of witnesses. He just didn't have the man himself. Surely, though, Dullea thought, the guerrilla killer will soon be swinging by a rope around his neck. But Earle had other ideas. He knew his house calls in the U.S. were coming to an end. He had to get further away. This time, a place where the newspapers wouldn't be talking about his distinctive giant hands and Bible. So he headed north. It was June, the spring flowers in bloom, when Mrs. G. Chandler spotted a stocky man with a Bible hitchhiking on the highway close to the city of Luna, Michigan. Chandler stopped and let him in. A lovely man, he thought, as he drove Earle all the way to Noyes, Minnesota, a long trip of about 1,000 miles. Earle was in new territory. This was as far north as he'd ever gone. He continued hitchhiking and was picked up close to the Canadian border at Emerson, Manitoba, by a friendly married couple, a Mr. and Mrs. Hannah, who took him about 68 miles to Winnipeg. This was a small city for Earle. The population was only about 180,000. The kind of place where hiding for someone as distinctive as he was isn't so easy. If he was going to blend in, though, first he needed new clothes. Earle walked into Jacob Garber's secondhand store and told him he wanted a different look, trading his blue suit for a herringbone coat. He bought some black boots, a gray felt hat, and walked away with $1 to spare. New look and apparently new outlook, since Earle then did something very out of character. He decided to get a regular job. A construction firm needed laborers, and for the first time in a long time, Earle had the opportunity to be gainfully employed. He got himself a room on the second floor of an apartment at 133 Smith Street, introducing himself as a Mr. Woodcotts to his new landlady, Catherine Hill. Mrs. Hill said that Mr. Woodcotts was a darling, polite, and well-mannered. She'd later say he was a very devout gentleman who always carried a huge Bible under his arm. He didn't have enough to pay for the rent up front, but he gave her his entire savings, his $1. He told her not to worry, though, that he'd have the other 11 by the end of the week. It likely took great powers of restraint for Earle not to strangle her right there, as he had so many of his previous landladies. But if he decided to turn over a new leaf, his resolve didn't last very long. The next day, on June 9th at around 10 p.m., he saw 14-year-old Lola Cowan standing at the steps outside of the house where he was renting a room. Her family had fallen on hard times following her father's illness, so after school, Lola would walk the streets selling artificial flowers that her sister Margaret had made. Earle walked past her, then stopped and asked her how much for the flowers. He liked the price, but she'd have to go up to his apartment with him to get the money. Lola followed Earle inside. The house was empty, none of the other tenants were home, and when Lola entered, Earle struck her on the head and then strangled her, just like so many of his victims before. He slept that night with her under his bed, leaving her there the next day when he set out to find a new room. On Riverton Avenue, he found what he was looking for, a sign in a window that said, "Room for rent." Lola hadn't had any money or valuables, so Earle had to tell the landlady, Emily Patterson, that he would do some repair work in exchange for the cost of the room. He could already see that her screen door needed fixing. She agreed. After all, he was so polite, a person of faith, just like her and her husband William. That evening, William came home. He asked his two children where their mother was. Gone, they said. She'd been gone most of the day. William was worried. He searched the neighborhood, but there was no sign of her. After putting the children to bed, he reported his wife missing to the police. He had a feeling that something terrible had happened. That night, before he slept, he dropped to his knees and prayed that his wife would return home unharmed. At that very moment, he opened his eyes, and he saw small fingertips poking out from under the bed. His heart was pounding, his mind ablaze with horror as he felt the hand. It was cold, and it was Emily's, Earle's 22nd confirmed victim. Stuffed under the bed, her throat crushed, her body horrifically beaten, the killer had bludgeoned her with a claw hammer. William almost fainted. When he had the strength to stand up, he pulled Emily up. Her wedding ring was missing. It wasn't the only thing that was missing from the house. The killer had taken one of William's most precious possessions, the family's Bible. At $70, it was a valuable item. William didn't expect the murderer to be a man claiming to be a devout Christian. The killer had also taken William's suit and some other clothes, leaving his own cheap clothes behind. But he had left something else behind, a knife that had a distinctive burn on the blade, exactly how the one used in the Fannie Mae and Maureen Oswald at Torthey murders in Detroit would be expected to look. Police were soon at the boarding house of Mrs. Hill. There had been no new customers, she said. Just Mr. Woodcott's, the man who came to stay on Wednesday. He was ever so nice, big hands too. They were taken to Earle's room upstairs. He wasn't there, but the body of Lola Cowan was already decomposing under his bed, strangled, mutilated, petals of artificial flowers lying next to her. The killer had done so much damage with the claw hammer that the first name that came to mind back at the police station was Jack the Ripper. The autopsy would leave the police stunned into silence. It was so appalling what had happened that Chief of Detectives George Smith said the details could never be released to the public. When the police were investigating, Earle knew that he had to get out of his clothes. He took $10 he had stolen from the Patterson family and bought a plaid shirt with corduroy pants from Sam Waldman's second-hand store on Main Street. William Patterson's clothes were left behind. Earle also bought himself a shiny fountain pen. He was never very good with money. When he went into the Central Barber Shop for a makeover, a shave and a haircut, the barber Nick Tabor noticed something about this client, something he didn't like at all. He could see dried blood under the man's long fingernails. Stranger still were all the scratches on his scalp. He asked about them, and it appeared to make the man uncomfortable. Nick could never have imagined that these were the result of Emily Patterson fighting for her life. He had seen enough to be suspicious, though. So as Nick went to the police, Earle, now looking fresh and clean, stood in the street and held out his thumb. He was soon in the car of Hugh Elder, heading to Regina, Saskatchewan, about 200 miles to the west. There, he impressed the landlady, Mary Rowe, who gave him a room on June 12th. He proudly signed in with his new pen as Harry Harcourt. Back in Winnipeg, the public was in a state of shock. The city council offered a large reward, $1,500 Canadian, for information that led to the arrest of a man described as a criminal degenerate. Earle was a hunted man. This wasn't the USA. The cities were smaller, with fewer places to blend in or hide, and word traveled fast. Earle woke up the next morning and opened a newspaper to find a very accurate description of himself on the front page. They even knew that he had bought new clothes. So he went to the Royal Secondhand Store, buying a khaki shirt and some blue overalls. He got a cap to pull over what he'd read the newspaper describe as his strange face, and he headed out to hitch a ride. That's when Isidore Silverman, a scrap metal dealer, saw a man in the street with a Bible in his hands. He was heading to Boissevain, Manitoba, and Earle got in. Just a few minutes later, though, they started seeing police patrols getting ready for what looked like something major. So shocking was the news about what Earle had done in Winnipeg that the police had begun blocking roads and searching cars. But the roadblocks weren't modern checkpoints. In 1927, a handful of officers couldn't stop every vehicle on every back road, and with a new outfit, his cap pulled low and a calm face, Earle didn't look like a monster. He looked like another working stiff catching a lift. The predator was now the prey, though. Earle made it to Manitoba, but when he entered a general store, he was recognized by the owner, who got on the phone with Constable Wilton A. Gray, the only officer available at the small police department. While Gray made some calls, Earle, certain now that he was being hunted in Canada, was looking for a way out, back to the USA. Earle was about 12 miles from the border, walking down the street in a small farming community as if he didn't have a care in the world when Constable Gray approached him. The constable didn't want to scare the stranger off and politely asked for his name. As a longtime drifter, Earle was used to being stopped by the local police in towns. "Wilson," Earle replied, explaining in a polite manner that he was a farmhand who worked nearby. He was good, entirely believable, lies coming to him as easily as murder. Gray looked for small changes in the man's facial muscles when he told him he was looking for the murderer of maybe 24 women. But Earle was as cold as ice, his acting worthy of the best stages in the world. Making light of the situation, he said, "A mass murderer? I only do my lady killing on Saturday nights." Gary told him that he could easily check his story. Smiling as cordial as ever, Earle replied, "Fair enough, you fellows have to play it safe when there's a killer on the loose." At that moment, Gray actually thought it couldn't be him. No killer with that much blood on his hands could be that cool. But just to be sure, he told the man that he'd take him back to the station. There, he took Earle's shoes and double-locked his cell, fastening his handcuffs and hands to the bar. Gray then went to speak to Inspector Smith in the room next door. "Got a man in the cell. 99% sure it's not the killer, but thought I'd arrest him on the off chance. Says his name was Wilson." Unbeknownst to Gray, though, Wilson was one of the killer's known aliases, and his physical description was a perfect match. The next word sent a shiver down Gray's spine. "You didn't leave him alone, did you?" When they went back to where he was being held, all they found was an empty cell. The handcuffs were on the floor, a nail file and some wire under his bunk. Earle, the guerrilla killer Nelson, was gone. Surely he couldn't get that far, they hoped. After all, he didn't even have his shoes. An armed posse was quickly formed and 4 detectives flew in from the US, with still others on their way by train. As the police searched every street, every doorway, every store, Earle was fast asleep. In a barn just 1 block from the police station he'd escaped. When he woke up the next morning, he calmly made his way to the train station. He saw that cops were everywhere, though, so Earle hid in some bushes planning to jump the next train south. Earle had slipped past and escaped from the authorities so many times that he was sure he'd be able to again. But that's when he was seen in the bushes by Constable William Renton. Earle leaped out and ran as fast as he could. He was scaling a fence when Renton grabbed him. Renton didn't know for certain that it was the guerrilla killer. The man he had detained looked like a drifter. His clothes were old, his shoes weren't shoes at all but a pair of hockey skates with the blades missing. Earle played innocent, pointing to a building where he said he worked slaughtering livestock. Renton was about to ask him another question when Earle took off again, sprinting to an oncoming train. He had just boarded a carriage where Detective George Smith from Winnipeg was standing with a gun. This time there would be no running away. Captain Matheson from the San Francisco Police flew to Winnipeg. At the station where Earle was now behind bars, Matheson confirmed that it was him, the man known as the Guerrilla Killer. His face bruised and scarred. Witness after witness from the US, around 40 of them made the journey to Canada. They took one look at Earle, and that was enough. Even his Aunt Lillian turned up, as did the wife he once driven to a nervous breakdown, Mary. He wouldn't speak to either of them, refusing to answer their questions. They both confirmed he was Earle Nelson. At the Rupert Street Police Station in Winnipeg, close to 4,000 people waited outside, all of them wanting to know what the demon they had read about in the papers looked like in real life. But not once did Earle admit that he was who he was, still claiming to be Virgil Wilson. His fingerprints matched those found at various crime scenes in San Francisco. His teeth matched bite marks on some of the victims. There was the burned knife, the bodies under the beds, the clothes he'd left behind, dozens of positive IDs by witnesses. His answer to all of these, all of them are wrong. The evidence appeared to be overwhelming, but they still had to find him guilty in a court of law. As he waited in his cell for the upcoming trial at the Winnipeg Law Courts building, he remained quiet. From morning to night, he read his Bible, taking a particular interest in a chapter from the book of Proverbs. For a prostitute is a deep pit, an adulteress a narrow well. She lies in wait like a robber and increases the traitors of mankind. Was he thinking the women he killed were at fault? That they had somehow seduced him into killing them and defiling their bodies? On November 5, 1927, Earle Nelson finally stood trial for his crimes. He truly believed that he could convince a jury he was an innocent man, looking them in the eye and asking, how could such a good Christian be capable of doing such terrible things? It didn't work. It took that jury less than an hour to find Earle guilty of the murder of Emily Patterson. While his number of victims could be confirmed at 22, some estimates place it at over 30 or higher. Just one was enough to see him hang, though. Asked at the trial if he had anything to say, he responded, "No, not that I know of." His execution was set for January 13, 1928. The location was Vaughan Street Jail, just over the road from the Patterson home, where William had discovered the body of his wife and Earle's last victim, Emily. His days on death row were spent reading the Bible and trying to convince anyone who would listen he was innocent. His court-appointed attorney, James H. Stitt, wrote a 30-page letter to the Minister of Justice, Ernest LaPointe, asking for clemency. Earle Nelson was quite clearly mad, insane since his childhood accident, maybe even earlier. Stitt included statements from various people who had witnessed Earle talking to people who weren't there. There was medical evidence that he'd been declared deranged and psychotic. As a doctor had said years ago, the madness was constitutional, not induced by drugs or alcohol withdrawal, but inherent to his psyche. But if Earle was crazy, it didn't prevent him from knowing how to plan a murder, and he was certainly sane enough to know how to escape. It appeared his mind functioned well enough when he needed it to. At 7:30 a.m. on Friday the 13th in January of 1928, Earle stood on the wooden platform inside the police station. There was no crowd of spectators, just a few detectives, officials, and some relatives of the victims. It was the new long drop method. His neck would break instantly. His death would come quickly, quite unlike the experience of many of his victims. Standing before a dangling noose, his last words were, "I am innocent. I stand innocent before God and man. I forgive those who have wronged me and ask for forgiveness of those I have injured. God have mercy." One person who wasn't present was Lieutenant Dullia of the San Francisco Police. He was at home with his wife in California as the guerrilla killer was hanged. He knew that he'd be caught and punished for his crimes eventually, but one thing that did surprise him is how little coverage Earle's death received in the U.S., especially after his crimes had been covered so sensationally. He didn't know why that was the case, but there was one thing that he was sure of. There would be more killers like Earle Nelson in the future. Of that, Dullia was certain. A plumber stands outside of a large house in an affluent North London suburb, staring down at the blocked drain. The resident of flat 23D, a polite, bespectacled man, offers his theory. Someone's been flushing their Kentucky Fried Chicken. The plumber just shakes his head. He's pretty sure that what he's been handling isn't fried chicken at all, but human eyeballs and lungs. Dennis Nilsen grew up in a small fishing town in northeast Scotland. It was a bleak existence, wandering in states of melancholy under slate-gray clouds, watching the North Sea waves smash into the coast. If it weren't for his grandfather, the one person he truly loved and admired, Dennis would have been lost. Then one day his grandfather went out fishing and never came back, dead of a heart attack at 62. Dennis looked at the pale, stiff body in the casket. "He's gone to a better place," his mother assured him. "He's at peace." At that very moment, something deep inside Dennis Nilsen changed. He soon grew withdrawn, drifting through life, watching the herring boats bob on the distant swell out of reach, like the boys at the school he secretly desired. He was teased relentlessly. They would shout sissy at him in the playground, shame him at school, shame him at home, shame him at church. What he needed was escape, and at just 16, that's what he got. He fled south, beginning a new journey that would one day put him on the front pages of newspapers. In 1978, he was 33, his childhood in Scotland a distant memory. Now a civil servant in London, he was a hard worker, timid, but liked by everyone in the office. People completely unaware that he drank to oblivion every evening, his mind beset with fantasies. He tried the gay scene, the one-night stands, but picking up strangers always felt soul-destroying. It wasn't for him. He wanted something deeper, a real connection. He found it with Stephen, a popular young man into pop music and football. Dennis spotted him trying and failing to buy a pint in a pub. It was Christmas and Stephen had just come from a concert. Dennis, who had been working late as usual, watched from the corner. He invited Stephen back to his place for some drinks instead. Stephen wasn't gay, but Dennis, a former soldier and former cop, didn't fit the stereotype of what Stephen imagined a homosexual man to be. Filling his glass one after another, Stephen passed out with Dennis sitting at his side. He'd fantasized about this moment for years. Slowly, he unfurled his necktie from his work shirt collar and carefully wrapped it around Stephen's neck. His knuckles turned white as he gripped. He pulled it tight, Stephen waking, choking, petrified eyes, and then silence. Peace. "You'll stay with me," Dennis whispered into his ear, "at least for the new year." He drowned him in the bathtub just to make sure he was dead, lovingly cleaning the body with soap and water. The feeling could only be described as beautiful. Dennis had always wanted a man. Age didn't matter. Ever since joining the Army Catering Corps at 16, he wanted to be close to male bodies. Stationed in West Germany, surrounded by squatties, he felt ashamed of his feelings, so he drank to excess every night. He could drink the other men under the table, but he'd pretend to be drunk, flirting, sprawling half-naked in front of them, hoping that someone might take advantage. Awkward, they would just file out of the room. Dennis would sit up, disappointed and sober. The other soldiers visited local prostitutes. Dennis tried it, but found it overrated. Alone, he would masturbate, the climax only coming if he thought about limp bodies, passive, him as the dominant one. Then something happened. In Yemen, a dangerous posting, he was kidnapped by a taxi driver, smashed over the head, and locked in the trunk. When the guy opened it, Dennis fought back, knocking him unconscious with a jackhammer, and then locked him in the trunk. Back at base, an officer said, "You were lucky, Nilsen. They would have killed you." For months, he couldn't shake it, not the fear, but the arousal of an unconscious man being completely at his mercy. After killing Stephen, he wanted more. He just received a promotion at work to executive officer, a supervisory role, helping the unemployed find work. Now the boss, he often worked into the night, the perfect excuse to go on the prowl. And that's how he found victim number 2, Andrew Ho, a 19-year-old gay student from Hong Kong. Same again. "Let's go to my place and have a few drinks." Andrew was wasted fast, splayed out on Dennis's carpet. Dennis got the tie ready and was just about to use it when Andrew woke, stunned, screaming, pushing Dennis out of the way and escaping through the front door. He reported it to the police but dropped the charges. The officers, awkward around homosexuality, didn't pursue it any further. Dennis thought, "Well, now they know who I am." London was full of young tourists, and Dennis was more than willing to show them around. That's how he met Kenneth Ockenden, 23, from Canada, with a promise that he would show him the best London had to offer. First, what about a few drinks? Many drinks later, Kenneth started to drift off as he was listening to music with Dennis's headphones. Dennis slid over, took off the headphones, and wrapped the cord around Kenneth's neck. The music muffled as Kenneth groaned and died. Dennis poured himself a celebratory scotch, picked up the headphones, and finished what Kenneth had started. This one was a keeper. He'd wash the body, and for the next 2 weeks, he would take it from under the floorboards and sit it in an armchair next to the sofa, where they would watch soap operas and comedy shows on TV. This was the kind of intimacy that he'd been searching for all his life, moments captured by his Polaroid camera. The problem, and one that would haunt Dennis for years, is being intimate with the dead could only last so long. Corpses had a use-by date. No amount of washing or spraying deodorant could stop Kenneth from becoming bloated and putrefied. The nights in front of the TV stopped as Kenneth's body decomposed under the floorboards. Insects arrived. Maggots fed on Kenneth's liquefying organs. Dennis loved the intimacy, but this part made him queasy. There were more victims, more housemates, more lovers. Drink, pass out, strangle, and repeat. Depending on the weather, he'd get at least a good 2 weeks with them, but after that, it was television by himself, and he hated it. And as the bodies rotted, Dennis's Christian upbringing would bring shame. He'd often spit at himself in the bathroom mirror, cursing, "You're disgusting." He'd break down, sobbing on the floor. Only once had Dennis tried to have what you might call a normal relationship. After 11 years in the Army and a brief stint as a police constable, he'd met a guy outside of a pub, rescuing him from a fight. Dennis was strong, violence didn't scare him, and soon they were in a relationship. A soap opera romance. They'd agreed to get a place together, 195 Melrose Avenue. They played the happy couple, nights in front of the telly, decorating rooms together, and all the other things that people in relationships do. But after a few months, it felt like the mask Dennis was wearing started to dissolve from his face. They argued, vicious fights, insults they couldn't take back. Then it was separate bedrooms, inviting strangers back at night, and after a year, it was over. Dennis much preferred the dead, like that young runaway from Liverpool. He'd been sleeping rough on the streets, and Dennis was there with the offer of a hot meal and a warm bed. A few rum and cokes later, and Dennis was sitting on his chest, garroting him, eyes bulging, followed by tears of shame, and then the caressing and kissing as they watched Doctor Who. Dennis would masturbate over the bodies, but there was never any penetration. He wasn't an animal. One day, he'd have to try to explain this to the world. He was already dreading it, partly because he hadn't quite figured out what he was. Disposal was becoming a major problem. He'd keep the bodies under the floorboards, and when the oldest turned to maggots, the stench was unbearable. He would dissect it, removing organs, dismembering the rest, usually vomiting in the process. The heads weren't as difficult as he'd first imagined. He'd boil them for hours. The flesh, eyeballs, and even the brain could be turned into a soft paste. He would dump it in the bushes and long grass in the park beside the house. He knew local kids played hide-and-seek there, but he doubted anyone would recognize a boiled, mushed brain. Still, he knew it was a risk. The trouble was the big bones, the legs, arms, and torso. Those same kids often wandered past his garden. It faced the park, so when he burned pieces of limbs and torso, they would show up excited, thinking he lit a bonfire. He'd burn rubber to disguise the smell as the kids' parents peered through their living room curtains. When the kids danced around the flames, it was beautiful, like a tribal show of respect around the pyre of his great lovers. The next morning, he'd rake up the bone and skull fragments and then toss them in the dustbin. He tried to stop, and he did for about a year. But then he met a young Scottish man who'd made the mistake of not just talking to him, but agreeing to have a drinking competition with him. Dennis thought, well, you asked for it. The Scot never had a chance. Soon he was stiff in an armchair watching the 9 o'clock news, as Dennis talked to him in earnest about a miners' strike. And then there was the skinhead kid and a young lad from Belfast, both summer murders when the bodies decomposed fast. The dissections even more disgusting in the heat. He'd later explain how his days were always the same. End of the day, end of the drink, end of the person, floorboards back, carpet replaced, and back to work. No one suspected him. Yet. Sure, he was taking a lot of time off of work, but most of the victims were just poor kids, runaways, so they didn't bring much heat. But then in September 1981, Dennis made his first major mistake. He'd found a 23-year-old man slumped against a wall outside of a pub. In full view of the street, he asked the guy if he was okay. Groaning, the guy said that he'd taken too much of his epilepsy medication. Dennis, the Good Samaritan, helped him to his feet and walked him to his own house, where he called for an ambulance. The guy spent the night in the hospital, and the next day he returned to Dennis's place to thank him for possibly saving his life. "No problem at all," Dennis said. "Glad I could help. Do you want to come in for a rum and coke?" A few hours later, the man was stuffed in the cupboard under the kitchen sink. Surely they'd been seen together. He was walking on thin ice. Then his world was turned upside down. His landlord asked him to move out. He wanted to renovate the house. There were still 5 bodies under the floorboards, most of them already dissected, but one still whole. He phoned the office saying he was sick and he needed a few days off. On the upside, the landlord paid him £1,000 in compensation. Dennis had to work hard for a few days, his bonfire burning non-stop. At least the neighbor kids were happy. With his $1,000 in the bank, Dennis rented a flat at 23 Cranley Gardens, a large Tudor-style house in the leafy suburbs from where professionals commuted to the city. He just joined the ranks of the middle class, but for a serial killer, it was far from ideal. The house was split into 5 flats, so lots of nosy neighbors. Worse still, it didn't have much of a garden. Dennis had the top flat, a great view, and he liked the skylights, but terrible for getting rid of bodies. Winters were the loneliest times for Dennis, with the winter of '81 no exception. He occasionally invited men up to his flat but resisted killing them, knowing he would struggle with disposal. He was surprised the cops hadn't already knocked on his door, but it seems that he wasn't on their radar. He was still dreading being caught, not so much prison, but explaining what he was. As winter turned to spring, he was faced with a dilemma. He got a guy so drunk that he couldn't wake him up. He wasn't even trying to kill this one, but what was he supposed to do? The guy was just lying there. He wound a strap around the man's neck and started pulling. From a drunken slumber, the guy came around with a vengeance, serving Dennis a dose of his own medicine and throttling him. Eventually, the man passed out, only to open his eyes and go at Dennis again. 3 times the man sprung back to life. A few months later, Dennis met a 21-year-old in drag at a cabaret bar in Camden Town. The guy had just been dumped and had a broken heart. After endless glasses of rum, the man woke up unable to move his arms and legs, cocooned in Dennis's sleeping bag. Dennis leaned over and whispered for the man to stay still. The next thing the man knew, he was waking up in a bathtub, his head pushed under the water, and then blackness. He was soon sitting upright in the armchair facing the TV, Dennis at his side. According to Dennis, the man had almost strangled himself trying to get out of the sleeping bag. Over the next 48 hours, the man drifted in and out of consciousness. When he eventually came to, Dennis, concerned, told him that he was taking him to the hospital. The last thing Dennis said when he dropped him off was, "I hope one day we meet again." They would, but not as Dennis imagined. He should have stopped, but he was lonely. He killed another and then another in October 1982. 20-year-old Stephen, a runaway, and they got drunk and listened to The Who, passed out, and Dennis leaned over him and said, "Oh, Stephen, here I go again." This one he almost felt sorry for. He had bandages on his wrists covering deep cuts. Pity soon turned into worry. What was he going to do with the bodies? He had 3 of them now dissected, stored, bits of crushed bones, heads, and organs that he'd already flushed down the toilet. The pipes couldn't take it. Soon all of his neighbors complained their basins and toilets were overflowing. Dennis would meet them in the hallway on the way to work. Terrible, and to think how much we pay for this place. He was living on borrowed time. His mind was racing, trying to think of solutions, because he was sure he had a lot of skeletons in his closet. Real ones and secrets. "It looks to me like someone's been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken," Dennis told the plumber, Michael Catran, pretending to be concerned. Catran had pulled stuff out with his hands, and it smelled rotten. It looked like flesh and bones, and definitely not from a bird. Catran later returned with his boss the next day. Yep, no question they were human remains. An hour later, as Dennis was busy at the office, a pathologist was at the house on the phone to the police. Human, and possibly more than one victim. Not long before, he'd scooped an eye from a drain and found bits of lung. As Dennis went to work the next day, detectives pretending to be workers from the council told him that there was a health hazard, but it was nothing to be too concerned about. When he returned home in the evening, one of them asked, "Can we take a look inside your flat?" As soon as they walked through the door, the stench of decomposition almost knocked them over. With Dennis watching, they pulled out human flesh from the drains. Dennis played innocent. How did that get there? But it was useless pretending. He had to come clean. "In there," he said, pointing to his wardrobe. "You'll find what you're looking for." Before they opened the door, one of them asked, "What are we gonna find?" Dennis sighed. "It's a long story. It goes back a long time. I'll tell you everything. I want to get it off my chest." Dennis was sitting in the back of a police car, his wrists cuffed. It felt strange that he was almost glad. An officer asked, "So 1 or 2 people?" Dennis didn't even hesitate. 15 or 16 since 1978. Upstairs in his flat, gloved hands were holding a severed head. How could he explain watching television with dead bodies? One of the detectives simply said, "Why?" Dennis was being honest when he replied, "I was hoping you were going to tell me that." Was he insane? The judge didn't think so, not after the guy who'd escaped explained how Dennis had carefully lured him into a trap. On November 3, 1983, he was sentenced to life with a minimum of 25 years. In 1994, the British Home Secretary ruled that he would never get out of prison as long as he lived. In 2018, aged 72, Dennis died of a pulmonary embolism and internal bleeding. No family members were present during the cremation. In his memoirs, he left the world a message. There are monsters in this world. They're just people. There are strong people and there are weak people. I think I'm an amalgam of the two. Detectives stood over the remains of 2 teenage girls, Sheila Swanson and Melissa Sanders. Both had been bound and brutally murdered. They weren't the first. There had been more missing girls, more decomposing bodies, abductions, hikers vanishing. Then there was the case that shocked everyone, a vicious axe attack involving 2 young female students. And it had all been happening off the same road. Highway 20 stretched out over 450 miles, a long isolated road dotted with poor logging towns and flanked by endless dense forest. It was scenic in parts, desolate in others. When the mist moved in, everything was swallowed whole. It was the ideal hunting ground for a monster searching for prey. In 1992, 2 teenagers, Melissa, 17, and Sheila, 19, were drifting. Like many kids from the small town scattered along Highway 20, they were struggling to find purpose. There were no jobs, not much hope, and they'd started falling in with the wrong crowd. Like everyone else, they just wanted out. The girls never had much money, and after dropping out of high school, the future didn't look bright. The highlight of their days was hanging out with friends at the local Sherry's restaurant. It's where the girls first met the state highway mechanic, John Ackroyd, a man far too old to be keeping company with teenagers. And to detectives who'd been watching him for years, he was the last person who should have been befriending young women. Little did anyone know, he had already started his path of terror. Late in May, the girls went camping with Melissa's parents at Beverly Beach State Park in Oregon. The place did nothing for them. Bored and restless, they just wanted to get back to their boyfriends. Using a payphone, they tried to arrange a ride, but Melissa's place in Sweet Home was an hour and a half away, too far for anyone to make the trip. So the girls decided to hitchhike back. We'll get to what happened next, but first, this is our new channel for all things true crime. If you want us to cover more cases like this, please hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep making videos like this. And let us know in the comments what you want us to cover next. Now back to what happened to Melissa and Sheila. Melissa's parents woke early the next morning and were met by an empty tent. The girls were gone. They assumed they had gotten bored and called someone to pick them up. But when the family returned to Sweet Home a few days later, there was no sign of Melissa. Her father searched for her and called her friends, Strangely, no one had seen her. With panic growing, he reported her missing. Sheila from nearby Lebanon didn't return home either. Her family were frantic. Soon, the girls' faces were on missing posters in every local town. The net was closing, but too slowly. Had a man named Marvin Laurent seen those posters, he might have had cause for concern. On the day the girls went missing, he had been starting the graveyard shift at the state highway shop in Sweet Home. One of the state mechanics pulled up in his rig. Laurent knew the man always dropped it off before heading to his truck, but he never had seen him arrive this late at night. It was John Ackroyd, and he had dried blood all over his hands and arms. Most guys hunted in this part of the USA, but it wasn't normal to be walking around covered in blood. "Hit a deer," said Ackroyd when he saw the shock on Laurent's face. "I had to gut it out." Even stranger, he told Laurent after gutting it, he threw it into the brush. It didn't make any sense. John washed up, got in his truck, and drove away. Something wasn't right, and Laurent knew it. About 5 months later, Laurent was listening to the radio when he heard the news. The bodies of the two missing girls had been found by hunters. They had been murdered, and their bodies were bound and naked. And his mind went back to that night. The bodies were too decomposed to determine the exact cause of death. The report said the police had found a rivet next to the body of Sheila, something often used by mechanics doing field repairs. They suspected it might have dropped out of the pocket of the killer. Laurent couldn't stop thinking about it. John Ackroyd, the blood, the unlikely story of gutting a deer in the road, and then just throwing it into the forest. And the rivet. What kind of man would be carrying a rivet? Laurent was right to be suspicious. In 1977, 20-year-old Marlene Gabrielson was a single mother in Lebanon, a town about 14 miles away from Sweet Home. She had barely left the house since she had given birth to a girl 3 months earlier. It was time for a night out. She and her husband decided that they'd get a babysitter and head over to the Sisters Rodeo with friends. They drove about 90 miles into the dense expanse of forest, setting up camp with friends and sitting around a fire drinking beer. Marlene didn't like to be away from her baby. Tension flared when she started arguing with her husband. He wanted to go off with some friends, and that is exactly what he did. Marlene told the others at the campsite she wanted to head back to her baby, but it was after midnight. They were virtually in the middle of nowhere. To make it worse, she was already drunk. So when a man told her that he was also going to go back to town and he had a friend who would take her too, she was delighted. Soon, she was sitting in a truck's front bench seat squeezed in between the man and the driver. The driver barely said a word, and he smelled of stale sweat. But Marlene was just happy to have a ride. The other man got out after a few miles. Marlene noticed there were no door handles on the passenger side. Strange. Her head was still dizzy from the beer, but she was sober enough to see the large hunter's knife sitting in an old coffee tin next to the driver's seat. Turning around, she spotted a .22 caliber rifle in a rack. Calm down, she told herself, before drifting off to sleep. The driver was John Ackroyd. She woke to his hands around her ankles as he violently pulled her out of the cab, her head bashing against the doorframe. "You're going to do what I tell you," he growled as he pushed the knife up to her neck. Later, he just stood there staring at her as she cried in the undergrowth. "I'm not sure what to do with you," he said in a calm voice, pondering. "You could take me home," she whined. Enjoying the power he had over her, he paused and then said, "I'm not sure I want to do that." Not for a million years did Marlene want to get back into that truck, but so far from home, she didn't want to be left alone, so she tried to convince him that she liked him, and somehow it worked. He drove her back, stopping off at his house in Sweet Home. After asking for his phone number, she wrote it down on the back of a packet of cigarettes, evidence for the police. "Maybe we can see each other again," he asked before he dropped her off in Lebanon at the house of her mother-in-law. The door opened to what happened. Marlene, half-clad, dirty, hair all over the place, told her, "Call the police." This should have been the end of Ackroyd, but it wasn't. The police took his side. They believed him that Marlene had seduced him, that she had ripped her jeans, pulling them off in excitement, bruising herself, scratching herself on the forest floor. "She was wasted," said the other guy who shared the truck. He told the cops that he knew Ackroyd well, he wouldn't hurt a fly. The district attorney refused to prosecute. The only punishment Ackroyd received was a beating from Marlene's husband. But Marlene's story wasn't over. Almost 2 years later, there was a knock on her door. 2 detectives had seen the files, and they knew the original officers had almost certainly failed her. The physical evidence alone should have been enough to put John before a jury. But they weren't there to reopen her case. A young woman had just been murdered. Her body had been found on an isolated stretch of road off of Highway 20, just 30 minutes from where Marlene had been attacked. The police had a suspect. It was John Ackroyd. It was Christmas Eve, 1978, about a year and a half since Marlene's attack. 35-year-old Kay Turner was getting into her running shoes for a winter jog near Camp Sherman, about 55 miles from Sweet Home. The roads were flanked with snowbanks as she left her husband Noel early that morning at the campsite, where they and some friends were vacationing from Eugene. Kay had run a marathon earlier that year. Running had become an obsession in her friendship group, though no one else wanted to join her. She said that she wasn't going far, only about 8 miles, just an hour or so. But an hour had passed, and then another and another. Day turned to evening, and she still hadn't returned. Kay was a manager at a local public health agency back in Eugene. Smart, responsible, and far too careful to get lost or stay out knowing that Noel would be waiting for her. Noel and the others searched the roads about 5 miles around the campsite, but they found nothing. Frustrated and worried, they called the police. Detective Clayton Dewar of the Oregon State Police and 2 detectives drove over to Camp Sherman to interview people and ask if they had seen a jogger out on the roads. A man named Thomas Hanna came forward. He had been heading home after a night shift as a highway worker when he passed her. He told the detectives that another highway worker had also driven by, 29-year-old John Ackroyd. This was a bad time for a missing persons case. The locals had been on edge now for well over a year. In June 1977, 2 young women, both Yale students, had been attacked at Klein Falls State Park, about an hour southeast of Camp Sherman. Like something from a campsite horror story, they had instinctively known all day someone had been watching them from the trees. Just before midnight, they were in their tent, trying to sleep, when they heard the sound of a truck. Before they could even move, the engine revved and the truck drove right over their tent, pinning one of the girls under the tire. Her bones smashed, her lungs crushed. The other girl looked up and saw a dark, towering figure with an axe in his hand. She begged for her life as he hacked at her head 6 times, causing severe brain damage. For a reason the girls never understood, he allowed them to live. He just got into his truck and drove away. He was still on the loose when Kay had gone missing. So when detectives heard the name John Ackroyd again, he became a possible suspect in both cases. They started digging into his past, and soon a story emerged of an unhinged man. In school, he had no friends, a loner. He was bullied, listed as special education. One of the locals who had known him back then recalled how he had once seen John take an axe to a litter of puppies. The same guy said John would happily shoot squirrels and cut off their tails. After flunking out of school and getting involved in petty crime, he joined the army, serving as a mechanic in Korea, then Thailand, and then Germany. But his criminal behavior followed him. He was caught selling weed, and then he went AWOL. After that, he was caught trying to sell army supplies. Every step of his life seemed to lead toward crime, and no one stopped him. After his short-lived military career, John returned to the towns of his childhood. Police knew he had seen Kay. His workplace in Santiam Junction was only about a 20-minute drive from Camp Sherman. On January 11th, detectives asked him about that morning on Christmas Eve. He told them he had clocked off from his night shift at 6:30 a.m. Instead of going home, he'd gone over to Camp Sherman to hunt coyotes. And yes, he said he had seen a runner fitting the description of Kay. But for now, he remained a person of interest. Police were more interested in Kay's husband. Kay had been living a secret life. Detectives discovered she was having 2 extramarital relationships. Maybe Noel had killed her in a fit of rage. Despite the Christmas gifts that he had hidden in the trunk of their car, they hadn't been getting on. Then there were her 2 boyfriends, both married men. Not only was Noel a suspect, but so were the other 2 men and their wives. Detectives were so sure that this was the reason for her disappearance that they developed tunnel vision, barely even conducting searches of the local forest. Trackers soon found a pair of footprints at the side of the road, perfectly preserved in the ice. They came from small Nike running shoes. Next to them were prints from work boots. It looked as if whoever wore the boots had scuffled with the person in the running shoes and then dragged them across the ground. But it wasn't enough for the detectives to pursue it much further. Then about 8 months later, there was a major break, something no one expected. Camp Sherman had a small local grocery store, the kind of place where the owners knew all the locals by name. The shopkeeper, Christine Weston, certainly knew John Ackroyd. He went in often. But one time, his odd behavior left an impression on her. A few months later, John went into the store again and walked right up to her. But what he had to say bowled her over completely. He'd claimed that he had just been out hunting rabbits with his dog, and he'd come across the body of the missing jogger. Looking shocked, or at least pretending, he told Christine he was nervous. After all, he had been the last person to see Kay alive, and now he was the first person to find her remains. Why did I have to find her? Ackroyd was inserting himself into the investigation, but why? Kay's body was by then just bones and cloth, but Ackroyd seemed to know it was a woman. Not just any woman, but Kay. She was lying just half a mile from where she'd gone missing. Detectives, now regretting that they hadn't conducted a serious search, soon found her yellow shorts, her blue pullover, and one of her Nike running shoes, as well as a part of another. In a tree above, the birds had used strands of her blonde hair with twigs to build their nest. Her gold-colored Timex watch was there, likely broken when she was fighting for her life. The time read December 24th, 9:27 a.m., just over an hour since she had said goodbye to Noel. Ackroyd was now the prime suspect. He kept changing his story. At first he had just driven past her, then it became that he had stopped, and later he had stopped and even talked to her. And then he changed his story again. He had told them he actually had found Kay's body months earlier but decided not to tell the police. She was much less decomposed then. He could see her throat had been slashed and that she had been shot in the breast area, and he even touched her remains. He claimed the reason he hadn't told the police is that he'd been worried they would finger him for the murder. For the detectives, it was possibly a case of a killer returning to the scene of the crime, something serial killers often do to relive an experience. But the story changed again. Ackroyd said that when he had talked to Kay that morning, he hadn't been alone. As God was his witness, he'd been with his hunting buddy Roger Dale Beck, both of them out looking for coyotes. In a voluntary interview, Beck admitted that he was there, although both men later changed their story and said that they had been illegally poaching deer, so had been worried about coming forward to the police. Ackroyd was either smarter than he seemed or very stupid. Was he placing himself at the scene of the murder to confuse detectives, playing dumb, a kind of I know how this must look detective? Or was he just a simple man with a simple mind who should have known better than to lie to the police? There was no physical evidence linking him to the murder. The body was too decomposed. They believed he had done it, especially after he failed a polygraph, but they had nothing to hold him with. As the years passed, Ackroyd melted back into his environment. He continued to work for the state, fixing broken-down vehicles, and always moving along those lost highways. In the mid-'80s, he married a woman, Linda. She had 2 young kids, Byron and Rashonda, both in junior high school. John was about to step into the shoes of a stepfather. On the outside, he appeared to be a decent man. He was putting bread on the table in a family that had experienced years of poverty, taking the kids out for pizza, going bowling and hunting. But inside of the house, things were very different. He beat the kids for the smallest transgressions, not just slaps, but black eyes, busted lips, welts from beltings. Linda had a string of relationships with bad men, drunks, thieves, and jobless drug users, so when John came along, former military with a stable job, she thought that her luck had changed. At first, that's exactly how it seemed. Byron and Rashonda thought he was great at the start, but after the marriage, the beating started. His temper was like nothing they had seen. They were good kids, never in trouble. They didn't steal or smoke or take drugs. Rashonda always helped her mom around the house. She was full of energy, always laughing, always playing on her bicycle when she wasn't in her bedroom. But when John became her stepdad, she transformed. Her joyful energy was gone. Her smile disappeared. Rashonda's teachers at her sweet home school couldn't believe how much she had changed. They'd always felt sorry for her. No one ever attended her parent-teacher meetings, but Rashonda had never seemed to let this get her down. She was almost always in a good mood. Then she started turning up for school with dread on her face. When the bell rang at the end of the day, she'd sit in the classroom alone, saying that she didn't want to go home. She confided in some friends that she was petrified of John, often pleading with them to sleep over at their place. No one knew the horror Rashonda faced at home, but it was about to get worse. It was July 1990. Rashonda woke up and, as usual, she helped Linda get ready, braiding her hair. She was watching cartoons as Linda and John ate breakfast and then headed out to their jobs. John was still a highway mechanic and her mom was a housekeeper at a resort community. There was no school that day, so Rashonda's only job was doing some household chores. She had to vacuum the house, take the hot dogs out of the freezer to thaw, and load the dirty plates into the dishwasher. She was about to start when something unexpected happened. John came back. Her heart probably sank. It was the last time anyone saw Rashonda again. John told the police he had dropped Linda off at work on Highway 20 and gone to fix snowplows. The parts weren't there yet, so he went home. His supervisor later told the police that there was a stack of work that day for John to do. John said he'd walked through the door and Rashonda was asleep on the couch. He claimed that when she woke, he offered to take her out to photograph deer, but Rashonda declined. She had too many chores to do. And that was it. John left. When he came back about 2 hours later, she was gone. Did he look for her? No, but he did pick Linda up after she finished work. Linda was mad when she returned home. Rashonda hadn't done any of her chores. She presumed Rashonda was playing out with friends, but it was strange she hadn't left a note like she usually did. Even stranger, after dinner, Linda and John had sex. Their sex life had been barren for years, but something had changed that day. It was great, John later told detectives, seemingly forgetting the conversation was about his missing daughter. Evening fell. There was still no sign of Rashonda. The next morning, Linda called 911. When the dispatcher asked her who had last seen her daughter, her reply was clear: stepdad, John Ackroyd. Now his name was connected to another murder. 11 years had passed since someone had killed Kay Turner, but there had been other missing women cases, and there had been those two Yale girls. The district attorney, Bill Hanlon, pored over John's file. There was no way this guy was clean. The next day, he and a deputy went over to John's house. John was outside painting the tailgate of his Ford pickup. He didn't seem the least bit concerned that his stepdaughter was missing. He knew her weight, her height, when she was born, even her bra size. When police later showed him some pants they'd found in the woods, possibly Rashonda's, they noticed he seemed excited. He was the prime suspect, but without a body, there wasn't much the detectives could do. Ackroyd seemed untouchable, at least for now. Months passed and there was a crash out on one of the forest roads. A total wreck, a car with a semi, a dead woman in the front seat. And as a highway worker, John was called out. The detective who met him, who had studied his file, asked him to help him remove the woman's body, all mangled and bloodied. It was a test. Most men would wince, some would even cry, but John seemed to enjoy it. And then he said something disturbing. As he impassively held her dead body in his arms, he said it weighed about the same as his missing stepdaughter, about 87 pounds. It was the same when he was interviewed about Rashonda at the station. Sounding completely unemotional, he explained to the detectives that an attractive girl like her would be easy prey for an abductor. No problem, he said, quote, "You could punch them and they'd just crumple. They got no fight in them." This was the same man the detectives were told would watch a VHS tape of Friday the 13th and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and he'd get excited pausing and rewinding the scenes where someone got hacked to death. His friends were so disturbed that they left. In the many hours of interviews over the years, John once told the police that's probably what happened to his daughter, that she had met a man in the woods like Jason Voorhees. He was being serious too. When they pressed harder, he grew defensive. Without a body, there was little they could do about Rashonda, and Kay, her case was still wide open. Years had passed, detectives retired, more girls went missing. Everything changed when Detective Will McAnulty got on the case in 1992. He was a rookie, but with fresh eyes on the files, he caught what others had missed. He focused not on John, but on Roger Dale Beck. Beck had served some time and then moved to California. His wife, Pam, knew John well. Years earlier, she had fallen in love with him and tattooed his name on her arm, but she had married Beck. McAnulty drove 750 miles to interview her. Surely those guys had said something incriminating over all those years. They had. They'd told her to lie to the police, and she freely admitted to McAnulty she had lied like hell. They told her they had gone out poaching deer that Christmas Eve. They had come back covered in blood. They claimed they had seen Kay and mistaken her for an animal. They opened fire, killing her. Pam had kept it to herself. She told McAnulty more, that Beck would get drunk and tell her he and John had actually assaulted Kay. If she and Beck argued, he would threaten her, saying that if you don't shut up, I'll do what me and John did to Kay Turner. The web of violence and lies was finally unraveling. After Rashonda went missing, Linda had thrown him out. He went to live with his mother. He still had his mechanic job, still driving on the deserted roads. Around the time McAnulty was investigating him, he was driving with the teenage daughter of one of his friends when she asked him to stop for two of her friends on the road. It looked like they needed a ride. Their names were Melissa Sanders and Sheila Swanson. They remembered they'd actually met John before at the restaurant in Lebanon. Great, they could now get back to their boyfriends. They were never seen alive again. The police were about to swoop in on John for the murder of Kay. Panicked, he emptied a storage unit he'd been renting. By the time police got there, everything was gone. But they already had enough to put him before a grand jury. He was soon behind bars at the Jefferson County Jail. Melissa and Sheila had been missing for just a few weeks. Had he known that he was about to get caught and desperate, addicted to killing, he committed one last crime? Police couldn't be sure it was him. The two girls had been hanging out with men with histories of violence, and detectives now knew that a few weeks before they went missing, Melissa had gotten herself into serious trouble after stealing some apparatus from a local meth lab. Violent meth dealers aside, John was a prime suspect. At least 5 other teenage girls had vanished from the county between 1984 and 1995, and John fit the bill for all of them. The list of victims kept growing, and so did the urgency to stop him. In 1993, he was convicted of the murder of Kay. Beck went down too. But it wasn't over. They interviewed John time and time again, but it wasn't until the early 2010s that detectives reopened the case of the missing girls on Highway 20. They went through thousands of files, connecting the old dots. The more they looked, the more they agreed John might have killed many more girls than was first thought, including Melissa and Sheila. There was also the Jane Doe found in 1976 on Swamp Mountain Road. Many years later, her remains were identified with genetic genealogy. Jane Doe became Marion Vinetta Nagel McCorder. She was 21 when she went missing while hitchhiking. Her aunt told the cops the last time Marion had called her, she said a man had offered to give her a ride close to Highway 20. And there was Rodney Lynn Grissom and his girlfriend Karen Jean Lee. Last seen in 1977 near Highway 20, they were trying to hitchhike to California. The last anyone heard from them was Karen calling from a payphone in Lebanon. "Our ride is here, I have to go." Their bodies have never been found. But police later discovered Rodney's watch. Close by were Karen's trousers, her blouse, a notebook, and a pair of jeans that looked as though someone had cut them with a knife. Detectives knew for sure that John would trawl Highway 20 looking for victims, and Jane Morris was proof. When she was 24, a few months before Kay died, she had just clocked off from her restaurant job near Camp Sherman. Riding her bicycle, John saw her and revved the engine, trailing her down the road until he caught up. Pulling out a handgun and pointing it at her, he screamed for her to stop. Shaking, she just kept going. Decades later, she pointed back. "Yes, that's him," she told a court full of people. That was about a year after the attack on those 2 Yale girls, but years later, they couldn't make an ID. One had a serious brain injury and the other had only seen a large silhouette coming at her with an axe. Elizabeth Musler was just 22 after she went missing from near Lebanon. Her body was found in a shallow grave just off Highway 20 in 1977. A year later, another girl was found, name unknown, the Lynn County Jane Doe. Then, another was found that same year, the Finley Creek Jane Doe. Maybe there were more killers than John in those desolate areas, or maybe they were all his, including Wanda Ann Herr, just 19, killed and dumped in the late 70s. No one even reported her missing. Her partial skull was found in 1986, but she wasn't identified until 2017. Detectives questioned John many times in his cell at Oregon State Penitentiary. He was now very unhealthy and walked with a cane. With almost $3,600 a month in pensions, he spent all of his cash on cheap processed food from the commissary. Struggling to breathe, he'd tell the detectives, "I have never killed anybody in my life." It was denial after denial. But in 2013, after detectives had compiled a strong case, John pleaded no contest to the murder of Rashonda. He neither confessed nor denied, but accepted he would never seek bail. There was still her body, still her mom and her brother. They wanted closure. They wanted to give her a burial. In 2016, detectives closed the case on Melissa and Sheila. John had murdered them, there was no doubt, but he was already going to spend the rest of his life behind bars. It wasn't worth the cost of a prosecution. It was December, just after Christmas, John's hunting season. He had so much more to tell and so many more secrets. But at the age of 67 in his cell that night, he collapsed and died from heart disease. He was found next to his false teeth on the floor. His sleep apnea machine still connected to his throat. The truth about the ghosts of Highway 20 also died that night. Toronto police spent years chasing a serial killer, and they found the evidence somewhere they never expected. In the 2010s, something weird was happening in Toronto, specifically in Church in Wellesley, the city's gay village. Men were going missing. The first disappearance happened on September 6, 2010, when 40-year-old Skandaraj Skanda Navaratnam was seen leaving a bar with another man. Then, on December 29th, it happened again. Abdul Basir, or Basir Faisi, was reported missing. When police asked what his last known location was, the answer raised a red flag, near Church in Wellesley. And then, things went quiet. For 2 years, there were no more disappearances. The cases became less of a priority, and theories floated about the fate of the 2 men. Had they just run away? Maybe they had left the area drunk and gotten into an unfortunate accident. The community was divided, but those divisions would come back to haunt them on October 14, 2012, when the son of 58-year-old Majid Hamid Kayan reported him missing. He had last been seen near Yonge and Alexander Streets in the Church in Wellesley area. Faisi was known to be pretty active in the community. In fact, all of the men shared a similar profile: middle-aged, Middle Eastern or South Asian gay men. This profile was way too specific to dismiss all the disappearances as coincidence. The police started an investigation named Project Houston that initially focused on Navaratnam's disappearance after an Interpol tip suggested he had been murdered. But as the investigation widened, detectives began to re-examine the other two missing men as well, and the people who might be responsible. One of the first names they zeroed in on was convicted murderer Luca Magnotta. Investigators discovered plenty of disturbing material but concluded that Magnotta wasn't responsible for the men who had vanished. Project Houston pressed on, interviewing dozens of people active in the village, looking for witnesses, chasing leads, and publicly they came up with nothing. Or so it seemed at the time. By April 2016, the police had found no leads, no evidence, and no bodies. There was no suggestion that the men were anything more than missing. The village community was reeling as police insisted that there was nothing to see here. Eventually, life went back to normal. There were no further disappearances until June 26, 2017. That's when 49-year-old Andrew Kinsman went missing, but police were still reluctant to take the case. Andrew was a 6-foot 2-inch tall, 220-pound man. The idea that anyone could easily overpower and cause him harm was hard for police to believe. But his friends said differently. Andrew had left something behind, something he would never purposely abandon: his cat. Police released an official statement acknowledging the local fears, while stressing that their investigation had found no link between the missing men. But pressure from residents continued to mount. Later that summer, people in the village held the town hall to try to understand what was happening. Many had started to suspect what police refused to consider: a serial killer was stalking their community. So the police began to look into Andrew's finances, phone records, patterns of behavior, and they found nothing to suggest he had disappeared voluntarily. In fact, they had found the opposite. There had been no activity on Andrew's phone or financial accounts since the day he vanished. As the investigation continued, detectives uncovered yet another disappearance in the village that had gone largely unnoticed: that of 44-year-old Salim Esen, who went missing in mid-April. Esen struggled with drug use and was officially considered homeless. Friends said that he had been on a good path rebuilding his life. So when his disappearance briefly caught police attention, it was dismissed as Esen leaving on his own once again. But the discoveries about Kinsman's phone and financial records, coupled with Esen's disappearance, forced the police to take the case seriously. For the first time, police were treating this like a potential homicide. They set up Project Prism, which was investigating the disappearances as probable foul play. That investigation, however, focused only on Salim and Andrew. The earlier 3 disappearances were still considered unconnected. Looking back, it becomes clear how they were eventually linked and how police had missed the connection years earlier. The first and best lead came from Andrew's friend Robin. She saw him on the day he went missing, heading out to meet a friend for coffee. When police searched Kinsman's apartment, they saw a note on his calendar for June 26th with one word: Bruce. Police assumed Bruce was the person Kinsman was meeting. Further investigation uncovered security footage from the neighborhood. It showed a man from Andrew's building getting into a red van around the same time and then driving away. Investigators couldn't confirm the man was Andrew, and the license plate wasn't visible, but the timing matched. It was when Andrew was believed to be heading out. The vehicle was later identified as a 2004 Dodge Caravan, the 20th anniversary edition. There were thousands of similar vans in the area, but only 5 were registered to men named Bruce. Of those, only one was a 2004 model, and it belonged to Bruce MacArthur. But subsequent investigations found it had been sold, probably for parts. For weeks, police scoured auto body shops and junkyards. In October 2017, they got a hit. An auto body shop an hour outside of Toronto confirmed they had a 20th anniversary edition 2004 Dodge Caravan, and it was bought from a man named Bruce. And it was mostly in one piece. Police rushed over to the junkyard and they began examining the van. And right there on the tailgate, surrounded by small flies, was a dried-up liquid. It was sent to the forensics lab and the results were clear. The liquid was Andrew Kinsman's blood. Detectives began tracking MacArthur's movements online and in real life. They believed a search of his home would reveal more. When MacArthur and his roommate were out, police entered the apartment. One officer accessed MacArthur's computer while others swept the apartment. In the bedroom, they found an orange stain on MacArthur's pillow, which was swabbed for DNA. Nearby was a 9-inch metal bar wrapped in tape. Detectives had been surveilling MacArthur for weeks. They knew his routine inside and out, and they believed they had a few hours alone inside his apartment that day. They were wrong. The surveillance unit tailing MacArthur called them. He was on his way back to the apartment. Police had only minutes to gather evidence, cover their tracks, and get out. In that time, they managed to download roughly 45% of MacArthur's computer data. It included a large number of photographs of men police would later recognize. Among them were Andrew Kinsman, Majid Kayan, Soroush Mahmoudi, and Skandaraj Navaratnam. But the real secrets weren't in what remained on the computer. It was in what had been deleted. Back at the lab, investigators began searching through recovered files. They found a photograph of Selim Esen dead on Bruce's bed, and then another, Andrew Kinsman, dead in the back of Bruce's car. Then came something worse. More photographs of dead men. Men who were not among the missing people police were investigating. But the police were about to get their biggest break, one that no one expected. The surveillance unit checked in. They had eyes on MacArthur, and he wasn't alone. He was with a man who matched the same profile as the other victims. Police rushed to MacArthur's apartment, where they were greeted by MacArthur. In the bedroom, they found a man tied to the bed with a bag over his head, but he was still alive. MacArthur was arrested on the spot. Police found duct tape, a bungee cord, and syringes, but no indication of where the men he killed might be. Without the bodies, the case was far from airtight. MacArthur refused to cooperate. Investigators were forced to consider the most likely explanation. MacArthur owned a landscaping business and had access to hundreds of properties, places he would regularly dig into. If the bodies were hidden anywhere, police believed it was there. Investigators began reviewing the properties of dozens of MacArthur's clients. One address quickly stood out: 53 Mallory Crescent. The owners were friends of MacArthur and permitted him to store landscaping equipment there, giving him regular access to the property and his own set of keys. Police searched the property with cadaver dogs, focusing on the backyard, but they found nothing. It was starting to look like a bust. And then something caught their attention: a row of large planters. The soil was frozen solid, so they were transported back to the lab for scans, and the first planter revealed something horrifying: a human ribcage. As police scanned the others, they found more remains, again and again. In total, the bodies of 7 men, more than the number police even knew was missing. This was the evidence they needed. MacArthur was charged with Kinsman's murder. 3 additional murder charges followed for Majid Kayan, Soroush Mahmoudi, and Dean Lisowick. In February, police added another charge, this time for the murder of Skandaraj Navaratnam. Then, in April, 2 more charges were laid for Abdul Basir Faizi and Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam. And months later, after the snow melted, Hamid's body was found near the same property where the others had been recovered. Police laid another additional murder charge against MacArthur, but unease remained. What if there were more victims they didn't know about? After all, they hadn't known about all the missing men before. How many lives did Bruce MacArthur actually take? But there was still one part of the story that hadn't been answered. MacArthur should have been caught earlier, a lot earlier. So just how did Bruce MacArthur get away with these murders for so long? Partly, he knew who to target. In fact, if MacArthur hadn't targeted Andrew, a man who was open about his sexuality and deeply connected in the area, he might have continued killing for years without detection. Some of MacArthur's victims kept their sexuality hidden. A few were even married, living double lives. Soroush Mahmoudi was one of them. He was 50 years old, married, and living in the suburbs. His wife reported him missing on April 22, 2015, a week after she last saw him. He was never connected to the men missing from the village. He had taken care to remain discreet, keeping his presence there hidden from almost everyone. Dean Lisowick had been discharged from a shelter just days before MacArthur killed him. To police, a disappearance like that did not initially raise alarms. Lisowick was never reported missing, and his family was used to long periods without contact. Another victim was an undocumented refugee from Sri Lanka who had fled the Civil War and sought asylum in Canada. After his claim was denied twice, he went into hiding, taking odd jobs and sending money home. His disappearance was never formally reported. When family members later posted about him on Facebook, many assumed that he had simply gone into hiding after his refugee claim was rejected. But police had a chance to stop MacArthur. In November 2013, he was brought in for questioning. He had been linked to all 3 men years before his actual arrest. His username, SilverFox51, was found in one of the victims' computers. MacArthur also said he knew him vaguely from hanging out at the same bar sometimes. A second victim had written the same username down on a notepad in his apartment, but MacArthur's strongest link was to Hamid Kayan. MacArthur willingly admitted to a sexual relationship with him and said that at one point Hamid had also worked for him, but after questioning, the police let MacArthur go. That will always haunt the village community. According to the police, MacArthur had an affable manner and look. He even played a mall Santa in the past. The fact that he also came in as a witness helped detectives make up their minds. But others also point out that because the village is such a tight-knit community, a lot of men frequent the same bars and cafes. They use the same dating sites. MacArthur having loose links to 3 of the men wasn't unique or surprising. However, he had plenty of red flags in his past that should have tipped police off earlier. In 2001, he beat a man with a metal pipe. Instead of jail time, he was given a psychological assessment which determined he probably wouldn't reoffend. MacArthur was put on probation and banned from visiting the village for a defined period of time. Then in 2016, he assaulted someone again. In both cases, MacArthur used the same strategy to avoid serious scrutiny. He went to police voluntarily and reported the assaults himself on his own terms. In 2001, he told investigators he had believed he had assaulted a man, but he claimed he couldn't remember the incident. In 2016, he said he believed his victim had wanted to be choked. That victim was a married man whose wife did not know he was seeing other men. He had little incentive to press charges or push the investigation further. There are some who believe the police didn't take these crimes seriously as they affected the gay community. There was also the fact that most of the men weren't white and some had issues with drugs and homelessness. Many believe police only took the possibility of a serial killer seriously after Andrew Kinsman, white and well-connected, was found dead. MacArthur is currently serving 8 concurrent life sentences for his crimes with parole eligibility after 25 years, but he was 67 years old at the time of sentencing. In practical terms, it amounts to a life sentence. I preyed upon the weak, the harmless, and the unsuspecting. Carl Panzram wasn't just a serial killer. He was a man who wanted to wipe out the entire human race, to become a black hole that snuffed out all life on planet Earth, and he spent his entire life proving it. Most criminals become infamous for one act. A few especially notorious ones, like some of the worst serial killers, may have a string of them. But Carl might just put them all to shame, because for him, crime wasn't just what he did, it's who he was. And this is his twisted story. By 1918, at just 27 years old, Carl Panzram was already wanted in multiple states for armed robberies, extreme violence, and brutal acts of depravity. He was going by the name of John O'Leary, and one place he figured he could disappear for a while was the U.S. military. So he enlisted in the Army in Myersdale, Pennsylvania, and almost immediately deserted. From there, he headed out to Baltimore, where he and an accomplice robbed a hotel and walked out with $1,200. The bright lights of New York City pulled him in next. With a borrowed Union card, he secured a seaman's ID and slipped onto the crew of the James S. Whitney. The ship carried him through Chile, Panama, and Costa Rica. He worked in copper mines and on oil rigs. He stole constantly, fought anyone who crossed him, and even worked as a hired enforcer, beating laborers into compliance on behalf of wealthy American owners, before taking off into the jungle. Among the indigenous tribes that he met there, Carl saw something he didn't think existed anymore. People untouched by what he called the corruption and hypocrisy of Western civilization, the forces he believed had ruined his life. That realization twisted into something worse. Soon he wasn't just dreaming of a robbery, but of sabotage, disaster, even starting a war, grand plans to kill strangers and watch the world burn. And it didn't take long before he found an opportunity to turn those fantasies into real bodies. In Panama City, Carl recruited a sailor into a ruthless scheme, steal a schooner that he'd been watching, and murder the captain and crew, 6 men in total. It should have been an easy job, but his accomplice ruined everything. Drunk and impatient, the sailor tried to pull it off alone, killing all 6 crew members only to realize too late that he couldn't sail the boat by himself. He was arrested almost immediately. Carl vanished into Panama, then caught a ship back to the US and from there made his way to Glasgow, Scotland. Caught robbing a ship, he ended up in Glasgow's infamous Barlinnie prison, a brutal place for most, but for Carl, practically a vacation. Even so, his time there fermented a deep hatred for Britain, a grudge that he would one day plan to avenge. After his release, he drifted through England, France, and Germany, living off of robbery after robbery. In Germany, he had hit a jewelry store, fencing $7,000 worth of jewels for $1,500, enough to live large in Hamburg for a few weeks. As usual, the money evaporated, and by 1920 he was back in the US, flat broke, hungry, and furious. That's when he arrived in New Haven, Connecticut, and spotted the perfect target, a beautiful colonial home belonging to former President William Howard Taft. Taft had been the Secretary of War when Carl was locked up at Fort Leavenworth as a kid, the place where, as he later said, any good in him had been smashed out. Taft had personally signed the papers that put him there. Carl was about to settle an old score. He robbed the house, taking thousands of dollars worth of jewelry and Liberty bonds, plus a pristine Colt M1911 .45 caliber pistol. Among the stolen items was an engraved watch given to Taft by Congress when he served as the Governor General of the Philippines, an era where the U.S. was slaughtering hundreds of thousands of Filipinos, burning villages, torturing prisoners, and letting others die from famine and disease. To Carl, they were hypocrites, every single one of them. And if the world was that rotten, he figured there was only one solution. Carl knew he was evil. He admitted it. But all people are, they just don't know it. The only solution as he saw it was brutally simple: kill as many people as possible and thin the herd. Humanity was a parasite feeding on nature, a biological accident that should have never happened, and now he was about to correct the mistake. With the $3,000 he'd gotten in cash, Carl bought himself a yacht, the Aquista, and moored it in New York Harbor. It was the perfect disguise. He now looked like a rich man, exactly the kind of person young, desperate sailors wanted to work for. He'd dress in the expensive clothes that he had stolen and haunt the docks around 25 South Street looking every bit the successful employer. He walked the piers watching for young men down on their luck, guys grateful for a warm meal and a job offer, blind to the danger smiling back at them. Carl was big and powerful after years of hard prison labor, but he always preyed on the weak. He'd wine and dine them, pour drinks, crack jokes, and earn their trust. Then, when they would fall asleep below deck, he would take out the Colt pistol, press it behind their ear, and pull the trigger. No hesitation. To him, they were just more bodies to weigh down with rocks and roll over the side into the black water. One sailor was so excited for the job that he thanked Carl for, quote, giving him a chance. Carl later admitted he smiled because he knew exactly how much the boy was about to suffer. The next morning, the kid sailed like he'd been promised, but not at the helm. He was in the hold, dead. For about 3 weeks, Carl repeated this ritual: lure, liquor, bullet, water. By the end, 10 men were dead, and the Aquista was packed with enough cash and valuables to keep him going for months. He kept 2 men around, Delaney and Gilmore, though even he wasn't sure why. One afternoon, drifting through Gravesend Bay, he climbed aboard an empty boat and robbed it in front of them. They were horrified. Carl didn't care. He'd already decided they were next. But things didn't go according to plan. Drunk, he wrecked the Aquista near Atlantic City and lost everything on board. Carl nearly died from shock and exposure. When he finally crawled onto the shore, frozen and furious, he was arrested for a minor offense and spent 6 months behind bars. But losing the Aquista wasn't rock bottom for Carl Panzram. It wasn't even close, because the day he walked out of that jail, he was ready to unleash something even worse. And this time, his victims wouldn't even make it into the water. If there was one thing Carl enjoyed, it was a good fight. And in the 1920s USA, hardly a day went by without workers on strike brawling with scabs and cops in the street. And that's why he joined the flying squadron of the Seamen's Union. Things quickly got out of hand, guns were pulled, and Carl found himself facing charges of aggravated assault and inciting a riot. He had no intention of sticking around. He paid bail, headed to Norfolk, Virginia, and boarded a ship to Europe, robbing it, of course, before landing in Spain and from there making his way to the Belgian Congo in Africa, and later Luanda, Angola. And this is where his evil nature went into overdrive. It wasn't that he particularly hated other races. When it came to causing pain, he was an equal opportunity predator. With his massive frame and no-nonsense attitude, he landed work in the Sinclair Oil Company, making life hell for the local laborers under him. A modern-day slave driver paid to keep the workforce terrified and obedient. Isolated in a landscape of poverty and violence, he prowled for victims among the local youth. He eventually found one he considered handsome, lured him into a secluded place, assaulted him at gunpoint, and left him with his brains spilling into the dirt. This was also where Carl hired 6 local men with the promise of good pay if they helped him hunt crocodiles around the bay and backwaters. They set out to hunt, but they were the prey. Carl shot all 6 and dumped their bodies into the water for the crocodiles. He even tried to turn that massacre into a profit, stealing their canoe and planning to sell it off, only for thieves to steal it from him in the night. Carl was furious. In his mind, somebody always had to pay. Now we need to go back to where Carl started, because it was as bad as his crimes are. Wait until you hear what was done to him first. But really quickly, this is our new channel for all things true crime. If you want more cases this dark, please hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep making videos like this, and let us know in the comments who you want us to cover next. Carl was born in June 1891 to impoverished Prussian immigrant parents, the 6th of 7 children in East Grand Forks, Minnesota. The family worked a rough patch of land granted to them by the U.S. government. Between school and endless farm labor, Carl slept maybe 2 hours a night. Constantly exhausted, he was almost always sick. When he was 7, a severe ear infection pushed his father to try a crude surgery with a kitchen knife and boiling water. One of Carl's brothers would later say the injury caused permanent brain damage because afterwards something changed. As the infection spread deeper, Carl began to suffer seizures. His temper became wild. He lashed out at everyone for the poverty and misery of his life. By 11, he was fighting, robbing, and had gotten himself a one-way ticket straight to his first stint in reform school. It was his introduction to the depravity of American institutions built for boys just like him. Even though they were just boys, the punishments doled out by the school were brutal. It was so bad that the room the boys were taken to for their punishments was nicknamed the paint shop, because victims came out painted black and blue with bruises. But in the darkness of that school, Carl learned something dangerous. He learned that power over others could feel good, even if he didn't have any yet. And years later, when he was luring men onto yachts and into crocodile-infested water, he would insist that it was places like the reform school that had created him. But the world wouldn't have to wait long to see that evil was already festering inside of him. One day, Carl saw a box of rat poison on a kitchen shelf. It was the first time he seriously considered murder. But rather than killing anyone, he decided instead to burn the school to the ground, the first arson of many in his life. After his release from the reform school, he went right back to his violent ways. He'd beat kids in the streets taking their money, something he had to admit he got a real kick out of. By 14, he was already far gone. In addition to robbing, he was now also hopping train cars, which is where he would meet a group of hobos who welcomed him into their circle and who would show him their own kind of evil in time. Years later, that boy had become a 31-year-old predator walking the streets of New York, and by summer of 1922, Carl had a plan. He wanted another yacht, another Akista. All he needed were fresh papers. If he walked into the customs house and requested documents for his sunken boat, he could steal a similar vessel and simply change the name and the numbers to match the papers. But first, he needed money to survive. He robbed his way through South Philadelphia and Baltimore, signed onto a ship at Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and later checked into the Marine Hospital in New Orleans. That was a ruse. One night, he slipped downstairs into the pharmacy and emptied as much cocaine, morphine, and opium as he could fit into a suitcase. The haul earned him enough cash to have a good time. After that, he returned to New York for the winter, landing a job as a watchman at the Abico Mill Company. Then he headed back to New Haven, Connecticut, where he robbed the police commissioner's yacht and picked up a .38 Colt double-action side-brake pistol. Life was good, but something was missing. After stealing a yacht in Providence, Rhode Island, he sailed it to New York, and that's how he picked up George, a handsome young man from a good family. But this time, for reasons Carl couldn't explain, he didn't feel like killing him. In hindsight, that was the first big mistake of his life of crime. George was a mother's boy, the opposite of Carl. He was soft. He got seasick on the Hudson River, still believing he was sailing with a wealthy, generous man. Maybe for the first time in his life, Carl didn't want to admit who he really was, essentially a murdering, perverted pirate. But little by little, he let the truth spill out. He told George he wanted them to settle down somewhere nice. "I'll sell the yacht and we can start fresh," he promised. And he meant it. He really did like him. Carl then got a taste of his own medicine. A potential buyer came aboard the yacht one day. Instead of inspecting the boat and handing over the cash, the man pulled a gun. But Carl was ready. He had the police commissioner's pistol, and when the man's attention drifted, Carl put a bullet in his head. George was shaking, horrified, as Carl calmly rifled through the dead man's pockets. At least this murder was almost self-defense. Another day, another body, and this one thrown overboard attached to a hunk of lead. George was there for this grim sea burial, still terrified. It was too much for him to handle. George went back home to Yonkers, where he told his parents and then the police what had happened. Soon, Carl was in handcuffs again, facing charges of sodomy, burglary, and robbery. But again, he had a plan. He found himself a fancy lawyer, a Mr. Cashin, who told him that if Carl turned over his yacht to him, he'd represent him and get him off. Carl agreed, and sure enough, he beat the charge. Later, when Cashin tried to register the boat, he discovered what Carl had already known. The papers were not what they seemed. Broke and angry at himself for trusting George, Carl picked up another young man. This one he assaulted and strangled with a leather belt, dumping the body behind some bushes. He had to get out of Connecticut fast. So he headed back to New York and got a job as a bathroom steward on the Army transport ship the U.S. Grant bound for China. Carl had never been to Asia. It sounded like a fresh start. But Carl Panzram didn't do fresh starts. He got into a fight, and that was the end of his life on the vessel. It seemed like he was on a run of bad luck, and then things got worse. In Larchmont, New York, he tried to rob an express office and a train station. Security saw him as he had his hands on suitcases stuffed with jewelry, fur coats, shoes, and watches. He was laying it all out when he heard a click behind his head. He didn't even look around. He just picked up the axe that he'd brought and swung it. The guard ducked and the two men went into a full-on brawl. The guard could tell by Carl's face that he was fighting for his life. Somehow, he wrestled the axe out of Carl's hand and slapped on the handcuffs. Carl ended up facing a burglary charge. This time, the prosecuting attorney meant business. Carl agreed to a plea of guilty to avoid a trial in return for what was supposed to be a lighter sentence. He got 5 years in Sing Sing, about as heavy as you could get for burglary. First George, then the failed robbery, and now a two-faced lawyer. In Carl's mind, he hadn't been ruthless enough and he was paying the price, just like when he had trusted those hobos on the train all those years ago. He was 14 and still naive. They'd invited him into their carriage and they made him feel welcome, one of them. One night they passed the bottle around and they started talking. After so many beatings in reform school, it felt good to be with adults who seemed to actually care. Then, Carl got an education in evil. Once he was buzzed on the whiskey, they threw him and his belongings over the side. Carl was left bruised and humiliated in the middle of nowhere. When he awoke, he was gripped by an agonizing pain, dried blood covering his body. As he hobbled to the nearest town, everything suddenly became clear to him. In this life, you are either dominant or you are dominated. Kindness is weakness. Morality is for slaves. You are the predator or you're the prey. This was a lesson he soon learned again. At a tent city, some men took him in. They too assaulted him, and Carl could do nothing about it. The message was the same. If you aren't hurting someone, you're the one being hurt. But the world wasn't done teaching him lessons. The worst one was still coming, the one that shaped everything he became. Back then, he was still physically quite feeble, and that wasn't going to change anytime soon, so what he needed was a weapon, and he was already turning into a very skilled thief. And that's how he got his first gun. The sheer power it gave to him was intoxicating, but he was overexcited, and after sticking his gun into too many faces, the cops picked him up. Emaciated and filthy, they assumed he was just another poor runaway kid, one of many in America in those days. So like the rest, they shipped him off to the Montana State Reform School. Carl was older now. He'd grown stronger. This time, when the guards beat him senseless, he retaliated, nearly killing the warden by smashing him over the head with a piece of wood. For that, he got his first real taste of solitary confinement. And fighting back felt good. And Carl was about to meet someone who would help unleash his rage on an entire state. Later that year, he and a guy named James broke out. After stealing a stash of guns, they unleashed hell on small-town Montana, burning down stores, holding people up in the street, even torching churches. Jimmy was the perfect partner, abused like Carl, full of rage. But then Jimmy slipped up. When he tried to fence some candlesticks they had stolen from a church, the police picked him up. Carl was alone again. Back on the rails, he stayed well away from the hobos this time, moving from state to state, his teenage mind trying to figure out what he was going to do with his life. One thing was certain, he liked violence, and he was good at it. He felt zero remorse. Maybe he would start killing. The U.S. Army, he thought, that was a place where a man could satisfy a bloodlust and even get a pat on the back for it. Those days as a kid were playing in his 31-year-old mind as he contemplated 5 long years in Sing Sing. The judge who sentenced him, Judge Bleakly, was just another hypocrite as far as Carl was concerned. Heading home each night to a warm bed and showing up in church on Sunday, a man who would never consider how rigged the game of life really was. But it got worse. Once locked up, the authorities discovered Carl was wanted badly in Oregon, not as O'Leary, his alias, but as Carl Panzram. He owed the state 14 years, and that meant he was now facing close to 19 years total. He'd get out around the age of 50 if he survived that long. Sing Sing wasn't as bad as he expected, at least not at first. No one bothered him much as long as he worked the coal pile. The guards didn't even carry guns or batons. The young warden, Louis Laws, was tough, but he believed men like Carl were redeemable. Laws gave inmates more responsibility and freedom, which actually reduced violence. But Carl never had the chance to get comfortable. He'd already put himself at the top of the pecking order. Even the gangsters feared him. So, one morning, without warning, the guards dragged him from his cell and transferred him to the place reserved for the worst of the worst, Clinton Correctional, known as Dannemora, or to the inmates, American Siberia. After a series of train rides into the Adirondack Mountains, Carl, his legs chained, watched the Sing Sing guards walk away. 2 Dannemora men stepped onto the train, carrying shotguns and steel-tipped canes. As they passed the armed guards in the towers, no one smiled. No one said a kind word. Naked, the tattoo of eagles spread across his chest, scars everywhere from all the fights he'd had, Carl stood there shivering as he was told the rules. No talking at mealtimes or in the queue. When you walk in here, you march, no loitering. If you want to speak to a guard, you stand 6 paces back, fold your arms, and take off your hat. Violations will be punished severely. After that, Carl was handed his number, 17531. Then came a quick beating, no reason given, just a welcome gift. Every day was the same. Silence, broken only by the screams of the men being beaten. It was hell on earth. Carl didn't believe in God, but he was becoming philosophical. He knew exactly what he was: treacherous, degenerate, brutal, a human savage without conscience, pity, sympathy, or morals. But at Dannemora, he met his match. He tried to build a bomb in the workshop to blow part of the prison sky high, but the guards discovered it. They gave him the beating of a lifetime, smashing steel-tipped canes into his knees, his face, and his back. Carl knew violence better than any of them, so when he got the chance, he sprinted at a guard and cracked him across the skull with a heavy club that he'd made from furniture. The guard dropped and started having seizures. Carl figured that he'd killed him. No big deal, but the man survived. After that, he walked strangely and slurred his speech. Carl was lucky they didn't throw him into solitary, the box, indefinitely. After a few weeks, he saw what had happened to the men who went in there. They broke down completely. They were dragged across the street to the state hospital for the criminally insane. That's where Carl knew that he'd end up if he stayed much longer. It took months of perfect behavior, slaving in the workshop for 1.5 cents a day before the guards backed off. Carl still barely spoke. Silence was strictly enforced, so unlike in the other prisons he'd known, he couldn't recruit allies for a breakout. But one more year of that silence and he would go insane, never mind another 18. Slowly, he began assembling a rope ladder. If he could slip out at night, climb 30 feet up the wall, haul up his ladder, and scale down the other side, he would be free. That night came. He lifted his cell door off his hinges, slipped outside into the dark, and climbed a section of wall with small footholds. At the top, he secured a ladder using the hooks that he'd fashioned from garden tools and started his descent. Then, one section gave away. The ladder snapped and Carl plummeted 25 feet onto the concrete. Both ankles shattered, both legs broke. His spine was injured. When the adrenaline faded, the pain was beyond anything he'd ever known. He lay there all night until he passed out. In the morning, the guards found him. 4 of them stood above, grinning, the toughest man in the prison now yelping while they dragged his ruined legs. The newly built medical ward was right there, so he assumed he'd be taken in. Instead, they threw him onto the dirt floor of a solitary cell. Intestines twisted, legs mangled, and they left him there for 8 months. No doctor, no hospital, just a bottle of liniment oil. He had to reset his own bones, pulling them straight by hand. Eventually, they fused on their own. For the rest of his life, his legs would give him pain. After 14 months, still in agony, they finally took him to a hospital. It was a miracle that he was alive. They put him under and operated to repair the internal rupture. When he awoke, he was missing a testicle. This being Carl, 5 days later he decided it was time to test how he functioned. He left his hospital bed and attacked an inmate. He was caught in the act and thrown back into solitary. From then on, he was completely ignored except when food was shoved under the door. The very few friends that he had outside wrote letters, but the letters were destroyed. One day, prison inspectors visited his cell as he sat in the corner like a trapped rat. They were supposed to check that conditions were humane. Instead, they told him bluntly, "This is what you deserve." Carl would later write down his thoughts about this time in his life. Quote, "The more they misused me, the more I was filled with the spirit of hatred and revenge. There was no room for such feelings as love, pity, kindness, or honor, or decency. I hated everybody I saw." He spent years in that dungeon thinking about the past. Truth be told, the only person he ever really trusted was James. James had been a true friend. What he lacked in brains and brawn, he made up for in loyalty. "To hell with it," Carl once thought. "I'll join the US Army and kill people for flag and country." And the Army would change him forever, not by fixing him, but by finishing what his childhood had started. He was a 16-year-old kid when he turned up at the recruiting office at Fort William Henry Harrison in Montana. His breath stank of whiskey. He'd been wasted the night before, but they took him in anyway. Carl was no slacker. He excelled at weapons training at boot camp and was better than most of the boys, even some of the men when it came to physical tasks. Still, there was one major problem with Carl Panzram. He couldn't take an order. He could probably lead men into battle without flinching, but without discipline, he was a lost cause. And there was another disappointment, the lack of alcohol. He'd stalk the barracks at night thinking about taking one of the weak recruits aside for abuse, but without alcohol, it wasn't the same. Worse, it's tricky breaking out of camp at night, robbing churches, and drinking with the money he'd stolen. When they eventually caught him, he had a sack full of uniforms that he planned to sell. That was larceny, but in the military, it was pretty much treason. They didn't know what to do with him, so the case went up the chain of command and landed on the desk of William Howard Taft, who did not mess around. Carl was sent to the military prison at Fort Leavenworth. Of all the abuse and beatings Carl had already experienced, Leavenworth was 100 times worse. Thieves and murderers prowled the grounds as rumors spread that Carl had stolen from his own country. The officers gambled on how long he'd last. He was tough, but every single night he was no match for the men who assaulted and beat him. He never cried, never complained, and never surrendered, making sure that in every attack someone got hurt. Once, guards beat him so badly that he lay sprawled out, barely conscious, covered in blood. The guards waiting for the prisoners to finish him off, but no one did. Something changed that day. No one liked the guards, so when Carl, a teenager, took their beatings like a man, he gained respect. The guards' favorite torture was strapping men into a straitjacket so tight that they passed out. Carl took it smiling. Respect turned into admiration. The guards went further, marching Carl all day with a ball and chain on his legs to break him, but it only made him stronger and angrier. Months turned into years, and Carl quickly grew into a man, 6 feet tall, 200 pounds of solid muscle, arms as thick as lumber. He began getting revenge on the men who had abused him, using the only method he understood. He was a monster, and he knew it, an intelligent brute intent on punishing the civilization that had spewed him into a world of pain. He'd later write, "You taught me how to live my life, and I have lived as you have taught me." When he left Leavenworth in 1910, age 19, he had perfected his appetite for destruction, a nihilism he would cling to for life. He rode the rails from town to town, robbing at night, satisfying his violent sexual urges. He hated the homeless after what they had done to him, taking pleasure in making them scream. He rarely targeted women. Women were, quote, dirty, he said. He had proof. After attacking a woman in Denver, a green discharge appeared days later. Gonorrhea, the doctor said. From then on, he avoided females, though his denial of homosexuality was obvious to anyone who knew him. He was free only a few weeks before being jailed for stealing a bicycle. There, he met a safecracker who, in exchange for Carl's protection, taught him the trade. Carl liked him so much that when he was released, he broke back into the jail to spring him out. A daring but stupid act that earned him more time. Maybe it was more than professional. The safecracker thought so. Alone in a cell, he kissed Carl on the lips. For Carl, it was the first time anyone had been close without trying to hurt him. Confused, unable to understand intimacy, only domination or submission, he beat the man to a pulp. Afterward, they kept an awkward distance. In truth, Carl had felt something. He just couldn't figure out what it was. Intimacy, kindness, these were alien to him. After jail, he got a job at the Kansas State Fair, Colonel Dickey's Wild West show, and he liked it until he fought almost every single male worker. When he struck a horse, he was fired. That night, he snuck back in and set the animal tent ablaze. Horses burst out, making an awful noise, their bodies on fire lighting up the night. Carl watched from a distance, smiling. Those flames spread to the other tents, people and the animals running in all directions. Almost every animal died that night. It was the only act of violence in his life that he would later regret. From the circus, he found his next job, joining picket lines of strikers and fighting for fun. When bosses at the Illinois Central Railroad saw Carl brawling, they made him a deal. Work as a strike breaker, and they would pay well for cracking skulls. It was perfect. In St. Louis, he almost single-handedly broke up a strike and made a pile of cash. He was a mercenary for the rich, but he didn't care. No one was innocent in life. One thing did bother him, though. After becoming notorious for violence, rumors spread that he was a yegg, a burglar, one who kept young men a little too close. And in a way, it was true. After his strike days, he picked a couple of pistols and moved on from state to state with a partner in crime, a young male who helped him rob houses and hold up stores. It was a match made in hell until it all came apart when they were caught robbing a house in Jacksonville, Texas. They were sentenced to hard labor building roads. Carl felt jealousy for the first time when the prison guard who ran the chain gang took Carl's man for himself. He wanted revenge, but instead he tried to escape and was caught. His fury collapsed into pain when they hoisted him up by his handcuffs, left him naked and hung him from a pole. Then one by one they took turns lashing him with their snake whips. He barely even moved. He didn't groan, but something changed in him as he hung there, his body covered in welts. He'd later say, "There was blood on my back and murder in my heart." After that, he left a trail of blood and humiliation across America, robbing and assaulting his way from Texas to Oregon to San Francisco, but again, he was caught. Looking down a 7-year sentence in Oregon State Penitentiary, he broke out, except he didn't just leave after he had bent the bars of his cell. He brutalized some guards and found gasoline, setting the workshop on fire. The fire spread. Soon firefighters were dousing the blaze and Carl was in handcuffs, taken out to the yard where the inmates had been evacuated. They were all cheering for him as the guards held him down and broke both his ankles with a hammer. The warden Harry Minto was corrupt and the guards were sadistic, but Carl was a special case and he was delivered right into the hands of the notorious Jim Vinegar Cooper, known to the prisoners as the Man of Flogs. Vinegar had one job: break men's wills. A religious man, he took Carl to his torture room and whipped him for hours with his cat-o'-nine-tails. He'd hose Carl down so hard his eyes swelled shut. He threw him in the bathtub and gave him electric shocks with a device known as the hummingbird. But he never broke him. After an escape attempt, they put him in the dungeon, a pitch-black cell, for 60 days. Carl had to eat cockroaches to survive. With the dungeon beckoning, he broke out with an accomplice, a 21-year-old burglar named Otto Hooker. In the nearest town, guards surrounded them. Among them was Superintendent Minto, the man responsible for much of Carl's torment. Armed with his service shotgun, Minto cornered Hooker, who had a stolen pistol. Hooker shot first, killing Minto outright, and died himself in a gunfight the next day. Carl took the blame and received another 7 years. Now Minto's brother John was running the place. Carl escaped yet again, but was soon caught and sent back, where the new Minto devised a fresh form of punishment: the bullpen. A simple, yet brutal idea. Carl and the other troublemakers had to stand within a chalk circle for 14 hours a day, hands on each other's shoulders. Step over the line and they would be shot. Decades later, academic papers would call the bullpen a prison within a prison, in a place where men like Minto and Vinegar got away with torture and murder. Fortunately for Carl, the Minto brothers' reputation eventually alarmed state authorities. A new superintendent, Murphy, was brought in. He was decent and conditions immediately improved. Years passed and Carl was doing so well that he barely thought about escape. He even toured with the prison baseball team, living proof that if men aren't treated like animals, they can be civilized. But Carl Panzram was no ordinary man. With 4 years left, on May 12, 1918, he made his move. He sawed through the bars of his cell and hopped a freight train east. He was 27 years old, ready to become a sailor and see the world. Those would be Carl's 5 years of freedom: the yacht murders, the trips to Central and South America, Africa, and Europe. The same crimes that would eventually land him back in prison and finally on death row. His time at Dannemora ended with broken legs, solitary confinement, and years of hatred fermenting in the dark. But after a few years in the hole, his luck shifted. Severe overcrowding earned him an early release, and he was let out in 1927. His plan this time wasn't just stealing or murder, he wanted a massacre, maybe even a war. The plan was to find a train tunnel and plant explosives. He would wait outside until the Capital Limited or National Limited roared through. When the train hit the explosives, part of it would derail. Then came the real fun. He intended to plant glass containers of formaldehyde and other poisonous gases inside of the tunnel and ignite hundreds of pounds of sulfur, gassing the trapped passengers. He wrote, "I would be stationed at the rear entrance to the tunnel behind a barricade and armed, ready to shoot down anyone who had enough life to try to get out." But he wasn't done. He'd set a second bomb on a railway bridge. When the train was blown off of the rails, authorities would rush there, giving him plenty of time to tend to the disaster in the tunnel. Wearing a gas mask, he'd loot the bodies, stuffing money, gold, and valuables into sacks. He figured that he'd have an hour and a half, and he'd escape with at least $100,000, murdering 300 to 400 people in the process. When he finished with the US, he'd go to England and start killing there, still hating the British for reasons he never fully articulated. He imagined that if he blew up something and made it look like an attack by another country, he could start a war and be rich enough to profit from it, having already invested in the stock market with his, quote, advanced knowledge. To Carl, that was how the world really worked. War was a racket, he'd figured out, and he wanted in on the next one. He even imagined blowing up a British battleship in the Panama Canal. Excited, he scribbled onto a scrap of paper, "That would be very sure to start a hell of a big war. And in the meantime, I'd be salting away millions of dollars through speculating on stocks on Wall Street." Ambitious? Yes. Maybe deluded. But given his past, you could be sure he was gonna try. First, he needed cash for explosives. He ran 6 burglaries in Baltimore, 2 in Washington, D.C., and then swung back to Baltimore for 2 more. His master plan was coming together. But on August 30th, 1928, the D.C. police caught him. The cops found his room packed with stolen goods. "Name?" asked the investigator. "Carl Panzram," he said, choosing not to lie. "Occupation?" "Thief." The investigator smiled, thinking he was joking. Carl just glared, but then he shocked everyone by confessing he'd killed too many people to care about burglaries. Thinking he was insane or bluffing, they humored him and asked why. "People don't deserve to live," he growled. The legend of Carl Panzram was born. His aliases and stories checked out, at least the parts that could be confirmed quickly. Authorities realized they had a bona fide maniac on their hands. He was sent from jail to the far more secure Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas, not far from the fort where guards and inmates had once tortured him years before. He was done with running, done with grand plans, maybe even done with murder, as long as no one bothered him. One day in the mess hall, he stood up and announced, "You all know who I am and what I've done. I will kill the first man that bothers me." It worked. The prisoners kept their distance. Still, when civilian laundry foreman Robert Warnke interrupted his peace in the laundry room, Carl ripped a steel pipe from the wall and beat Warnke to death. The devil was still very much directing his thoughts. It turns out the devil was also in the dead man. Warnke was a member of the Leavenworth Ku Klux Klan. They took Carl straight from the laundry room to death row. There he met a young guard he took a liking to, Henry Lesser, and he told him his life story, the story that would one day become books and movies. When Lesser first asked what Carl was in for, Carl simply said, "I reform people." Lesser almost felt sorry for him. What a wretch! But Carl had brought it on himself. Other guards had strung him up for hours by his handcuffed wrists, punching and kicking him while he hung in agony. Even the prison doctor Harris Berman took pleasure in torture. Carl never complained. He never squealed. Instead, he wrote voraciously, filling page after page with his thoughts, reading philosophy and refining his theory about crime and punishment. He wrote, "You are making criminals much faster than you are reforming those who are already in existence." He was evil, and he knew it, but he never stopped believing others had played a part in creating this monster. His articulate nihilistic philosophy became a sensation among intellectuals around the world. Carl was like a specimen in the zoo, analyzed by experts, feared by most, admired by those who looked past his cruelty. In April 1929, he refused legal representation in court and asked for no clemency. Back in his cell, he wrote to President Herbert Hoover asking that there be no delay to his execution. When anti-death penalty activists sent him letters begging him to fight for his life, he wrote back threatening to murder them. He described in graphic detail what he had done to young men, confessing to 21 murders, but he might have killed over 100, and he'd abused or stolen from possibly thousands. He just wanted an end to the pain. On September 5, 1930, as he walked to the gallows, academics, wealthy spectators, police, and journalists crowded to see this highly unusual, intelligent beast of a human being. The executioner fiddled with the ropes as Carl, showing no fear at all, snarled, "Hurry it up. I could kill a dozen men while you're fooling around." When the executioner tried to push his head toward the noose, Carl spat in his face and slipped his neck in by himself. When the warden asked if Carl had any last words, he was met with a torrent of curses. Carl told the crowd what he thought of the world, how rotten humanity was. Then, silence. The executioner pulled the lever. The trap door dropped. Carl's neck snapped. It was over. His family wanted nothing to do with him. Penniless, he was buried in a pauper's grave. No name etched onto the stone, just a number, 31614. One of his last letters to Henry Lesser he'd signed off. "I'm sorry for only two things. These two things are, I'm sorry that I have mistreated a few animals in my lifetime, and I am sorry that I am unable to murder the whole damned human race." Carl Panzram blamed the world for what he became. Schools, prisons, churches, guards, wardens, judges, even presidents. Whether you think that's just an excuse or a brutal kind of truth is up to you. If you'd like us to cover more cases like this, where the line between monster and the world that made him isn't so clear, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments who we should cover next.